They said she was finished. They said her name would rot in drawing rooms from London to Edinburgh, whispered between gloved hands, passed like a disease from mouth to ear. Lady Seraphine Ashcroft, the woman a duke had touched and then thrown back. The woman who hadn't been worth keeping. She had stood in that ballroom with 200 candles burning above her head and felt every single one of them go cold. But here's what no one understood. What society never bothers to learn about the women it discards. The moment you stop caring whether they bury you, you become something they cannot touch. Watch what happens when a woman with nothing left to lose is handed the keys to a dying man's empire. The morning it ended, Seraphine was wearing pale blue. She remembered that detail later, when she was sorting through the wreckage of her life and trying to identify the exact moment she should have seen it coming. The color had been deliberate. She had spent 40 minutes with her lady's maid Eleanor, arguing over silk shades and ribbon width, because the Ashcroft family had been invited to Harwick Hall for the formal announcement of the betrothal arrangement, and Seraphine had wanted to look like a woman worth announcing. She had wanted to look like the future Duchess of Blackmore. She had worn pale blue, and Lucienne Blackmore had worn an expression she would eventually understand was not embarrassment. It was contempt. But that particular distinction requires time to learn, and at 23, Seraphine had not yet developed the vocabulary for what men's faces do when they have already made their decision and are merely waiting for the correct social moment to deliver it. Harwick Hall belonged to Lord Pembridge, one of the oldest political allies of the Blackmore family, and the rooms were full of precisely the kind of people who attended gatherings not to celebrate but to witness. The chandeliers were extraordinary, Venetian glass, 7 tiers, casting prismatic light across a sea of powdered faces and expensive fabric. Seraphine had stood near the tall windows overlooking the garden, holding a glass of white wine she hadn't touched, listening to her mother describe the flower arrangements to Lady Pembridge while keeping one eye on the doorway through which Lucian had disappeared 20 minutes ago. She should have followed that instinct, the animal awareness that something was already wrong before the words existed to name it. Instead, she watched the doorway, and Lucian came back through it with his hand resting on the arm of Charlotte Vane. The room did what rooms do in moments like that. It held its breath, collectively, the way a body tenses before impact. Seraphine registered the silence before she registered the significance. Then she registered Charlotte Vane's left hand, which was resting against the front of her gown with a specific kind of deliberateness, the kind that draws attention to what it is wearing. A ring, gold and sapphire. Blackmore family sapphires, which Seraphine had seen in a portrait in the Duke's private gallery, worn by 3 generations of Blackmore wives. She drank the wine. All of it. She set the glass down on the windowsill with more steadiness than she felt anywhere else in her body. Lucienne crossed the room toward her, and he did not look ashamed. That was the thing that carved the deepest, not the act itself, but the absence of shame in his face as he approached. He had the bearing of a man completing a transaction, not one delivering a wound. "Lady Seraphine," he said, "I need a word." "I imagine you do," she said. He steered her toward an alcove just off the main hall, half concealed by a curtain of dark velvet, which gave the interaction a grotesque intimacy. The geography of private conversations, borrowed for something that was going to be public knowledge within the hour regardless. "Our arrangement," Lucian began, "has apparently concluded," she finished. He looked faintly irritated by that. Lucian Blackmore was 27 years old and had inherited one of England's wealthiest dukedoms at 19, and he had spent the intervening years developing the specific impatience of men who are never required to wait for anything. He had dark hair and a jaw that portraiture would be kind to, and eyes the color of winter river water, cold, quick, and not particularly deep. "The Vane family holds 3 parliamentary seats," he said, "and significant interest in the northern shipping lanes. My father's estate carries debts that require the kind of consolidation that the Ashcroft match simply cannot provide." "The Ashcroft match," Seraphine repeated. She recognized herself in those words, not as a person, but as a category. A strategic instrument that had been evaluated, found insufficient, and replaced with a superior model. She had understood, in some theoretical way, that aristocratic marriage was transactional. She had simply not applied that knowledge to herself, because human beings have an extraordinary talent for believing that the rules which govern others will bend when they arrive at their own door. "I regret any inconvenience," Lucian said. "Inconvenience. The timing is not ideal. I recognize that." Your ring is on Charlotte Vane's hand, Seraphine said, keeping her voice very level, because the alternative was something she refused to perform in front of him. In a room full of people who traveled here specifically for our betrothal announcement. You walked in here with her on your arm before you spoke a single word to me. The word you're looking for is not inconvenience. Lucian's jaw tightened slightly. I don't see what purpose dramatics serve. Neither do I, she said, which is why I'm going to walk back into that room and spend the next 2 hours smiling at people, and then I'm going to go home, and I'm going to let you live with the version of yourself that just did this. She walked back into the room. She had been wrong about the smiling. She managed perhaps 40 minutes before the stares became too specific. The studied avoidance of her mother's eyes, the visible calculation on every face as the social arithmetic ran its course, and people began identifying which camp was advantageous to stand in. In aristocratic England, proximity to humiliation was contagious. People moved toward Lucien and Charlotte as subtly and inevitably as iron filings toward a magnet. She left before anyone formally announced anything. Quos. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Seraphine would later describe to no one, because she had no one to describe it to. Eleanor, who had been with her since childhood, understood without language. Her father said nothing useful. Her mother said a great deal that was worse than nothing. You must have done something, her mother said on the third day. A man does not simply change his mind. There are always signs. Were there signs? Mother. I'm only saying that for the future it would be prudent to consider how you present yourself. Charlotte Vane is very accomplished in music. Do you remember when I suggested the pianoforte lessons? Please stop. I'm trying to help. You're trying to locate something in my behavior that exonerates you from the social consequences of having a daughter he didn't keep, Seraphine said. Those are different things. Her mother went quiet. The silence was guilty, which was the most honest thing Seraphine had gotten from anyone in 3 weeks. The invitations stopped first, then the morning calls. Then she attended a garden party at Lady Whitmore's estate and spent 3 hours watching people recalibrate their warmth toward her in real time. Familiar faces becoming pleasant but distant, old friends finding reasons to drift toward other conversations. She was not cut directly. Cutting was aggressive and required intention. This was worse. It was the gentle, collective decision to treat her as less essential than she had been. Discarded women made people uncomfortable. Not because society was cruel, or not only because of that, but because a discarded woman was a reminder of what women were underneath the ceremony. Replaceable. Subject to revision. Seraphine went home, sat in the library that had been her father's before his health declined, and read Tacitus for 2 hours. The Roman historians had a clarity about power that she found medicinal. They did not dress up conquest in sentiment. Her father found her there near midnight. Edmund Ashcroft had been a formidable man once, the kind of figure who filled a room with his stillness rather than his noise. The illness that had worked through him over the past 4 years had stripped weight from him methodically, but his eyes were still precise. There is a matter I need to discuss with you, he said, settling into the chair across from her with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned to negotiate with his own body. The financial situation, she said. She had known it was coming. The Ashcroft accounts had been deteriorating since before Lucien. The betrothal had been, at least in part, her family's solution to a problem that predated her. Yes, her father said, and a proposed alternative. She set down Tacitus. Duke Alistair Ravenshade, her father said. He has approached the family through an intermediary, the name registered in layers. Ravenshade, one of the oldest titles in England, older than Blackmore by 60 years. The Duke of Ravenshade was a figure who appeared in histories more than in current events, a man who had built significant political influence in his prime and then retreated from public life as age and illness pursued him. He was 70 years old, and the physicians who attended him had, according to the rumors Seraphine had absorbed without intending to, concluded that he had perhaps a month remaining. He's dying, she said. He is ill, her father said. Whether he is dying is a matter of some medical disagreement, I'm told. The disagreement being between the physicians who say a month and the ones who say 6 weeks. Seraphine. I'm not being cruel, father. I'm being accurate. What exactly is the proposal? Edmund looked at his hands. Marriage. Ravenshade understands our situation. He is offering a settlement that would resolve the Ashcroft debts and provide for your mother and yourself in terms that the current landscape, after recent events, will not otherwise generate. He wants a young wife for his final month, Seraphine said. His reasons are his own. His intermediary was very clear that he is not seeking. Her father paused, and she appreciated that he found the phrase genuinely difficult. He is not seeking a conventional marital arrangement. He requires a companion of sufficient standing and intelligence. The settlement is real. The offer is real. Seraphine looked at the fire. The wood had burned down to orange and black. All the drama of the flame resolved into something simpler and hotter and without spectacle. Lucien gave me to society as a cautionary tale, she said. If I accept this, I become something different. I become the woman so desperate she married a dying man for his estate. People will say that regardless, her father said quietly. What changes is whether you have resources when they say it. That was the most useful thing anyone had said to her in 31 days. Arrange a meeting, she said. Ravenshade Manor sat at the end of 4 miles of private road in Northumberland, and the countryside surrounding it was the kind of landscape that made no attempt at charm. The moors were vast and gray-green and indifferent, the sky low and pressing, the trees bent by decades of prevailing wind into postures of permanent resignation. Seraphine had spent 6 hours in a carriage absorbing all of it, and by the time the manor emerged from the morning mist, stone walls the color of old pewter, towers at each corner, a facade that managed to be imposing without being beautiful, she had arrived at a state of mind she could only describe as the opposite of expectation. She had no expectations. That turned out to be the correct preparation. The household staff who met her at the entrance were 6 people, where a manor of this size should have had 20. They were orderly and economical in their movements, but Seraphine had grown up in houses, and she could read the specific silence of a household under strain. The interior was scrupulously maintained, no dust, no visible neglect, but the arrangement of furniture in the entrance hall suggested rooms that had been closed off, the household contracting around its center as resources were drawn in from the perimeter. Someone had been draining this estate for years. She didn't identify that thought as significant until later. In the moment, she simply filed it. The housekeeper, a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Graves, whose face had the compressed quality of someone who had been keeping a great deal of information in a small container for a long time, led her through corridors lined with portraits, and into a sitting room where tea was already set and the fire was substantially warmer than the rest of the house. "His Grace will be with you shortly," Mrs. Graves said. "He was insistent on receiving you in the study, but the physicians—" She stopped herself. "He will be here shortly." "Is he in pain?" Seraphine asked. Mrs. Graves looked at her with an expression of recalibrated assessment. "He manages it." "Does he prefer visitors to pretend otherwise?" A pause. Then something shifted in the housekeeper's face. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. "No," she said. "He does not." "Good," said Seraphine. "Neither do I." Mrs. Graves left. Seraphine poured her own tea, stood at the window looking out at a walled garden that had gone winter bare, and waited. Duke Alistair Ravenshade came into the room 17 minutes later, moving with a cane that he clearly disliked but was not going to pretend he didn't need. He was tall, had been taller before the illness curved his posture, with white hair and a face that illness had stripped to its structure, which was significant. Strong bones. A jaw that had once been hard and was now simply present. His eyes were gray and clear, and they moved across the room with the speed of someone whose body had slowed but whose mind had not accepted the arrangement. He was not what she had pictured. She had pictured diminishment. She had pictured the physical rhetoric of a man awaiting death. What she found instead was a man whose primary visible quality was attention, the specific, unsentimental attention of someone who had survived long enough to stop wasting it on things that didn't warrant it. He sat, with the deliberateness of someone who had made peace with the fact that sitting was now an act that required management, and looked at her. "Lady Seraphine," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected and carried without effort. "Your Grace, you're younger than I expected." "You're more alert than I expected," she said. One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more the precursor to one, the shape a face makes when it's decided that something is worth the small investment. "What did you expect?" "The dying," she said. "They have a particular quality in the final stage. You don't have it." The physicians would disagree. The physicians, she said, have a financial interest in the severity of your prognosis, don't they? He looked at her differently then. Not with surprise, more with the kind of attention that sharpens when something presents itself as actually interesting. Sit down, he said. She sat. My intermediary told your father I required a companion of intelligence, Alistair said. He was being tactful. What I actually require is someone with enough perceptive capacity to see what is happening in this household without being told, enough composure to function under social pressure, and enough strategic capability to help me do something about it. Do something about what? The people who are killing me, he said. The fire cracked in the grate. Outside, the wind moved through the bare garden. Tell me, she said. Massim. He told her over the course of 3 hours, with a directness she found startling in contrast to every other conversation she had participated in since Harwick Hall. Alistair Ravenshade was not a man who bothered with social cushioning, and in the current circumstances she was grateful for it. The illness had begun 2 years ago, a gradual deterioration with no single identifiable cause, which the physicians had attributed in sequence to his heart, his lungs, his digestive system, and most recently simply to age, with the finality of men who have run out of more specific answers. He had accepted none of these conclusions because he had noticed something that the physicians, arriving intermittently, had not. His symptoms were not consistent. They worsened after certain meals, certain evenings, certain interactions with specific members of his household. They improved when he disrupted his routines or removed particular elements from his diet. You think you're being poisoned, Seraphine said. I think I have been being poisoned, he said. Slowly, in amounts calibrated to look like natural decline. By whom? That is the question I haven't been able to answer alone. And you need a wife to help answer it. I need a person with legitimate access to my household who is not already part of it, he said. My current staff I trust, those who have been inserted over the past 3 years, who replace staff that left under circumstances I have since come to question. I do not. You're asking me to walk into a house where someone may be actively attempting to murder its owner, Seraphine said. Yes. And your offer in return is to resolve my family's debts and improve my social standing by giving me a title. And if I survive, which I intend to, a genuine partnership in the management of one of England's more significant estates. He paused. I am not looking for decorative company. I have outlived decorative company. I'm looking for someone capable of seeing clearly and acting on what they see. Why me specifically? She asked. I'm not the only ruined noblewoman in England. No, he said, but you're the only one who walked out of Harwick Hall without crying, and then sat alone in a library reading Tacitus at midnight. She looked at him. I have eyes outside this house, he said, without apology. I vet what I invest in. She considered this. Outside, the light was failing. The winter afternoon collapsing with the abrupt economy of northern England, taking the detail out of the garden walls and leaving only shapes. If I agree, she said, and we discover who is responsible for this, what happens to them? They are handed to the appropriate authorities with sufficient evidence to make the outcome inevitable, he said. And if your condition is worse than you believe, if the physicians are right and this is simply age, then you will be a widow with a title and a very well-documented inheritance before spring. That's a remarkably honest answer. I have stopped seeing the value in other kinds, he said. She stood and walked to the window. The garden was dark now, only the outline of the stone walls visible against the slightly lighter sky. Somewhere in this house, in kitchens she hadn't seen and rooms she hadn't been through, something had been wrong for years. She could feel the shape of it now that he had named it. The contracted staff, the specific silence, the housekeeper's face. She thought about pale blue silk, about 200 candles in a Venetian chandelier, and the specific sound a room makes when it decides you don't belong in it anymore. She thought about Lucian's face. Not ashamed, not regretful, merely transactional. She thought about her mother asking if she'd done something wrong. She thought about Tacitus and the Roman principle that power does not negotiate with sentiment, it negotiates with capability. She turned back. I want full access to household accounts, she said, every ledger from the past 3 years. I want the authority to interview any staff member without prior notification. I want your honest assessment of your condition every morning, not whatever version you've decided is appropriate for visitors. And I want your word that if we identify the parties responsible, no private settlement is made. No quiet removal. Evidence to the proper authorities. Public accountability. Alistair had watched her deliver all of this without interruption, which she suspected was not his customary mode. Agreed, he said. Then I'll marry you, Seraphine said. And God help whoever is in this house that shouldn't be. No mention of God, he said dryly. I find it imprecise. She almost laughed. The first one since Harwick Hall. It came from somewhere she'd thought had gone temporarily offline. Monday, she said. I'll return Monday. The wedding was small and fast and conducted with the procedural cleanliness of something both parties needed to complete rather than commemorate. A local magistrate, Mrs. Graves and the butler, a thin, quiet man named Holland, as witnesses. Seraphine wore gray. She had not been able to bring herself to white, and the blue was out of the question. And Alistair wore a coat that fit him the way expensive things fit men who used to be larger, and they said the words, and it was done. She was the Duchess of Ravenshade. That sentence required a moment to absorb, not because it was gratifying. Gratification was a luxury for people operating within a normal life, but because it was real in a way that very few things had felt real since Harwick Hall. A legal fact. A documented state. Whatever came next, this was concrete. London responded to the news in the way London responds to anything, with an immediate cascade of opinion that moved fast and didn't particularly concern itself with accuracy. The version that emerged first, and proved most durable, was the one she'd anticipated. Seraphine Ashcroft, discarded by Lucian Blackmore, and now clinging to the arm of a dying man for survival, had made the most elegant descent in a season full of them. Some said it was desperate, some said it was calculated. The charitable version was pity. Lucian Blackmore, she was told by Eleanor, who maintained a network of information channels through the servant class that no aristocratic intelligence apparatus could match, had laughed. She didn't hear this directly, but she received it, along with the precise quote. She's made herself a widow's income and called it a victory. Let her have it. She let him have that too. She was too occupied to address it. The first 2 weeks in Ravenshade Manor were the most technically demanding of her life. She had grown up managing a household. Her father's health had required her to take over its administration at 17, but managing Ravenshade was a different order of problem. The estate was large, the accounts were complex, and beneath the surface of its functionality was a structure that had been, methodically and over time, hollowed out. The household ledgers told one story until you read them in sequence and identified the pattern. Individual expenditures appeared normal. The drift, over 36 months, was extraordinary. Food costs for a household of 6 had been recorded at levels consistent with a household of 20. Supply contracts for wood, coal, and various provisions had been renewed with vendors whose pricing was substantially above market rate. 3 staff positions, kitchen assistant, groundskeeper second, and what the ledger described as a footman, were drawing salaries for people whose names did not appear in any other household documentation and who, when she quietly asked Holland to locate them, could not be found. Ghost employees. Someone was collecting their wages. She brought this to Alistair on the 6th day. He was sitting in his study. He was always in his study by morning, having insisted to the physicians that confinement to his bedroom accelerated rather than retarded decline, which was the kind of logic a dying man could deploy, and no one had the standing to argue. And he read through her notes twice, deliberately. "You found this in 6 days," he said. "The ledgers aren't especially sophisticated," she said. "Someone has been living off this estate the way parasites live, not taking enough at once to cause the host to notice, just enough, continuously, over a long time." "The vendors," he said. "Do you recognize any of the names?" "2 of them," she said. "One is a company registered in Yorkshire whose primary shareholder, when you trace the ownership through 2 intermediary firms, is the Harwick Group." Alistair's expression didn't change. His eyes did. "Pembridge," she said. "Lord Pembridge, who is one of Lucian Blackmore's closest political allies." She watched him reassemble this information into its implications. She had done the same the night before, sitting at the study desk by candlelight while the wind worked against the windows, and she had felt the shape of it arrive like cold water. This was not simply a financial arrangement. This was a coordinated campaign. Lucian and Pembridge using financial mechanisms to drain the Ravenshade estate, while the physicians, were any of them involved, managed the narrative of Alistair's decline. "He wants the lands," Alistair said. His voice was flat. Not with shock, with recognition. The northern properties in particular. There are 3 that border estates he already controls. A Ravenshade title that passed through bankruptcy or died without heir would make those parcels available in ways that an active duchy would not. "He needed you dying," Seraphine said, "without sufficient scandal to draw scrutiny. Just quiet, managed decline. And then I married the woman he disposed of," Alistair said, and there was something in his voice now that wasn't flatness, something drier and more dangerous. "How much do you think that irritated him?" "I think it occupied approximately 30 seconds of his attention," she said honestly, "which is exactly why we can work in it." Alistair looked at her with that particular quality of attention she had come to understand was not easily deployed. "He underestimated the inconvenience of the match," she said. "He expected a quiet widow. He got an accountant who has now identified his financial instruments inside your ledgers." "What do you need next?" he asked. "The 3 staff members I can't locate," she said, "and access to the kitchen records, not the purchase ledgers, the actual preparation logs, if they exist. I want to know what you've been eating and when your symptoms worsened." "Holland keeps those records," Alistair said. "He started keeping them 8 months ago when he became suspicious. He hasn't told anyone but me." "Tell him to tell me," she said. It was Holland who found the first physical evidence. He came to her study. She had claimed a small room off the main corridor, impractical as an administrative space, but useful because it had a window that covered the courtyard approach, with a small locked tin box and the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time for someone to give it to. Inside the box, 3 small glass vials, each labeled in a hand she didn't recognize, each containing a different substance. Holland had found them in the kitchen pantry, behind a false panel he'd discovered when he noticed one of the shelves sat 6 inches shallower than its neighbors. She took them to Alistair without opening them. He held one up to the light from his window. The substance inside was pale, crystalline, with the powdery density of something refined rather than raw. "I know a man in Newcastle," he said, "a chemist, former Crown Service. He can identify these." "Send Holland," she said. "Not a formal messenger, informally, and not through any channel connected to this estate's regular communications." Alistair looked at her. "You've done this before." "I've managed a household under financial siege since I was 17, she said. "Different enemy, same principle. Control what leaves the house, control what comes back." "Your father's situation." "His creditors had extraordinary reach," she said. "You learn to think about exposure." While Holland was in Newcastle, Seraphine received a letter from London. It came through the normal post, but the handwriting on the exterior was Lucian Blackmore's, which she recognized from the single letter he had ever sent her during their 3-month formal engagement. A brief and impersonal note confirming the date of an event, less personal than a business correspondence. She opened it at the window. It read, "Lady Seraphine, I understand you have settled comfortably in Northumberland. A word of advice, offered without malice. Ravenshade is a complex estate with a complicated history. I would encourage you not to involve yourself in its management beyond the domestic sphere. The legal and financial matters are being handled by appropriate parties, and interference by well-meaning but inexperienced persons can complicate matters significantly. I wish you well. L.B." She read it twice. Then she read it again because the specific phrasing warranted it. The legal and financial matters are being handled by appropriate parties, not are in appropriate hands, not are under management. Being handled by appropriate parties, present tense, active, as if there were current actors and a current arrangement that did not involve her or, she suspected, Alistair. She brought the letter to Alistair. He read it once and set it on his desk. "He knows you've found something," he said. "Or he's making preemptive moves," she said. "The letter is a threat without the vocabulary of a threat. He's asking me to step back." "Are you going to?" She looked at him. "Your Grace." "Alistair," he said, as he'd said twice before. "We're married." "Alistair," she said, "I walked into Harwick Hall wearing pale blue silk to celebrate my betrothal to that man. I watched him walk in with another woman wearing your family's ring pattern in sapphires before he'd said a word to me. And then I stood in that room for 40 minutes while 200 people recalibrated how much my presence was worth. Silence. I am not stepping back, she said. Holland returned from Newcastle on a Tuesday. The chemist, a retired Crown analyst named Dave Port, who had, according to Holland's careful account, taken one look at the vials, asked no questions about their origin, and required 4 hours to complete his analysis, had identified 2 of the 3 substances with certainty. The first was an arsenic compound in a refined form, tasteless, dissoluble in liquid, and designed for chronic low-dose administration rather than acute poisoning. In high doses, it killed quickly. In the measured amounts that the residue concentration suggested, it produced over months the precise symptom profile that had been attributed to Alistair's age and declining organ function, fatigue, irregular heart rhythm, loss of appetite, progressive weakness. The second was a plant-derived sedative compound, legal, available from apothecaries, but in a preparation twice the standard concentration. The third Dave Port could not identify. He had written, in the careful language of a man aware he was handling something combustible, "This compound is not commercially available in England. Its formulation is sophisticated. If my analysis is accurate, and I believe it is, this is a laboratory preparation of continental origin." Seraphine sat with this information for a long time after Holland left the room. Someone had gone to the trouble of procuring a non-English compound, someone with access to continental pharmaceutical networks, the financial resources to obtain it, and the patience to administer a 3-component poisoning regime over 2 years. This was not a crime of passion or opportunity. This was organized. This was a plan. She thought about the ghost employees drawing salaries from Ravenshade accounts. She thought about the vendor contracts traced to Pembridge's financial interests. She thought about Lucy Yen's letter arriving within days of her beginning to examine the household ledgers. She thought, they have someone inside this house. Not one of Alistair's trusted inner circle. She had assessed Mrs. Graves and Holland and the remaining long-tenured staff with every tool she had, and they came back clean in every reading. But the 3 ghost employees, the kitchen assistant, the groundskeeper's second, the footman who didn't exist in any documentation. She went to Alistair with Dave Port's written analysis that evening. He read every word. The silence afterward had a quality she hadn't encountered before. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of confirmation. Of a man receiving information that changes the emotional weight of something he already knew intellectually. 2 years, he said. At least, she said. Possibly longer if the early administration was more subtle. I thought I was dying of old age, he said. I thought my body was simply... He stopped. You're not dying of old age, she said. You're being murdered slowly by people who needed it to look like old age. Another silence. The third compound, he said. Continental source. That requires money and connections of a specific kind. Pembridge has them, she said. He spent 7 years in diplomatic posting on the continent before his parliamentary career. We need more than financial traces and a chemist's analysis, Alistair said. We need a chain of evidence that is unbroken and unimpeachable, because the people we are going to name are not people who respond to accusations. They have resources to bury this. I know, she said. It will take time. I know. He looked at her in the lamplight, the gray eyes clear and measuring. You signed on for a month, he said. At most. You're not dying of old age, she repeated, which means the timeline has changed. It also means the danger has changed, he said. If they realize we're building a case, they already know I found something, she said. Lucian's letter. Which means we have a period before they move more aggressively, he said. A window. Then we use it, she said. She started sleeping less. Not from anxiety. She had burned through the anxiety phase somewhere around the discovery of the ghost employees and arrived at the other side, at the cold, clear territory that operates beyond emotion's jurisdiction. She slept less because the work required it. By day, she managed the household and maintained the surface of a new duchess, learning her estate. By night, she sat with the ledgers, cross-referencing dates of Alistair's worst episodes with dates of specific food deliveries, looking for the pattern within the pattern. She found it. Every significant worsening of his symptoms occurred within 48 hours of a delivery from one specific supplier, a company called Hargreave & Sons, Provisioners, whose invoices were among the most routine appearing in the entire ledger. The products listed were mundane. The delivery schedule was unremarkable, but the dates were unambiguous. She cross-referenced Hargreave & Sons through the same ownership trace she had applied to the other companies. It took her 3 nights. The ownership structure was more complex, 5 layers of intermediary firms rather than 2. But at the end of it, filed with the London Companies Registry in 1847, was the name of the original founding director, Edmund Pembridge, Lord Pembridge's younger brother. She had it. Not everything, not enough for a full public case, but a thread with a clear origin and a pattern that was coherent and documented and would not look like coincidence to anyone applying honest attention. She was documenting the final ownership trace in her ledger, her handwriting steady, the candlelight firm, the house quiet around midnight, when she heard the sound. It came from below, from the direction of the kitchen. Not the natural sounds of a settling house. She had memorized those in the first week, the specific vocabulary of Ravenshade Manor's nocturnal rhythms, but a sound that was deliberate, careful, the sound of someone moving through a space they knew but were trying not to announce themselves in. She put down her pen. She stood. She moved to the door of her study and opened it without sound, which she had practiced because she had suspected this possibility for days, and stood at the top of the servants' stair listening. 2 voices, below. Low, but not quite low enough. The first she didn't recognize. A man's voice, unfamiliar, with an accent she placed as southern rather than local. The second she recognized immediately. It was the kitchen maid who had arrived 3 months ago with excellent references from a household in Surrey that she now knew with absolute certainty did not exist. "She's found the ledgers," the kitchen maid was saying. "She knows about Hargreave." A pause. Then the man's voice. "How much does she know?" "Enough. She's been tracing owners." "That changes the schedule," the man said. "We move faster." The Duke needs to have a very bad episode," the man said, "before she finds anything that can be officially reported. A final episode." The cold that moved through Seraphine, then, was not the cold of fear. It was the cold of clarity, the absolute zero of a moment in which every option is reduced to 1. She turned and walked back to the corridor and knocked on Alistair's bedroom door with the back of her knuckles, 3 times, quiet and deliberate. He was awake. She had learned he rarely was not by midnight, the illness having disrupted whatever schedule his body had once maintained. "Get dressed," she said when he opened the door. "Now. Don't eat or drink anything that has come from the kitchen in the past 12 hours. We're past the evidence-gathering stage." He looked at her face. "They're in the house," she said. "Right now. And they've decided to accelerate." Alistair Ravenshade, 70 years old, propped on a cane, diminished by 2 years of slow poison, looked at her with those clear gray eyes, and what she saw in them was not fear. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally stand on his side of the door. "What do we do?" he said. She had already started calculating. "First," she said, "we need Holland. Second, we need the chemist's documents secured off-site tonight. Third," she paused, and in the pause something shifted in her chest. Not warmth exactly, but the specific kind of recognition that occurs when a person realizes they have stopped grieving something and started building something else entirely. "Third, we need to send a letter to London." "To whom?" "To every person who watched me leave Harwick Hall," she said, "and decided I wasn't worth the social capital." She looked down the corridor toward the stairs, where the kitchen sounds had gone quiet in the way that things go quiet when they realize they have been heard. "Let them watch now," she said. Holland moved fast for a man who had spent 30 years learning to move quietly. Seraphine had him out of bed and in the corridor within 4 minutes of her knock, and he arrived already dressed. She noted this without surprise, because Holland was the kind of person who had been sleeping in preparation for something for a long time. He took the chemist's documents from her without being told twice, wrapped them in oilcloth from the supply closet at the end of the hall, and looked at her with the specific expression of a man waiting for the rest of the instructions. "The Newcastle address," she said. "Daveport. Can he be trusted with the originals overnight?" "He kept silent for 3 weeks after I first approached him," Holland said. "Yes. Take the Eastern Road. Not the main approach. Don't use estate horses. Take the bay from the secondary stable, the one not logged in the household register." Holland didn't ask how she knew about the unregistered horse. He simply nodded and left. She turned to Alistair, who was standing in the corridor doorway in his dressing coat, cane in hand, watching her the way a man watches something he has been trying to name for weeks and has finally identified. "The kitchen maid," he said. "You're certain it was her?" "I know her voice from 40 hours of proximity," Seraphine said. "It was her. And the man with her." "Didn't recognize him. Southern accent. He wasn't staff, or if he was, he's not in any documentation I've reviewed." She moved toward the staircase, keeping her footsteps even and deliberate, which means he entered the house through an access point not being monitored. Alistair followed her at his own pace, which was slower than she would have chosen and faster than anyone looking at him would have expected. That gap between appearance and capability, she had been cataloging it since the first day, adding it to her working model of him. "There's a servant's entrance on the north wall," he said. "It was used by the groundskeeper's staff when the gardens were fully operational. Hasn't been officially in use for 2 years. "Since the groundskeeper's second appeared in the payroll," she said. "Yes." They reached the ground floor. The kitchen corridor was dark and silent, the kind of silence that comes after movement, not before it. Seraphine stood at the kitchen door and listened for 30 seconds before pushing it open. Empty. The fire in the range had been banked but not extinguished. On the preparation table, a cup, recently used, the residue still liquid at the bottom, sat beside a small ceramic pot with its lid slightly displaced. She did not touch either. "They've cleared out," she said. "For now," Alistair said. She turned to look at him in the kitchen's dim light, and what crossed her mind was not relief, but calculation. They had moved, which meant they knew she had heard, which meant the window Holland had left through was the same window that was now, functionally, closing. "We have until morning," she said. "Maybe less. Once they report back, to whoever is directing this, the next move won't be subtle." "What do you need?" "I need you to eat nothing and drink nothing that I haven't prepared myself until further notice," she said. "I need you to tell me every name connected to this estate's financial management over the past 3 years. Solicitors, trustees, advisors, everyone. That list is long. Then we start now." They worked through the remainder of the night at the study table, Alistair talking and Seraphine writing, and the quality of those hours was unlike anything she had experienced in any previous version of her life. There was no ceremony in it, no performance. Just two people with a problem too large for sentiment, moving through it with the particular efficiency that comes when the social scaffolding has been stripped away and only the functional core remains. He named 12 names before the clock reached 3 in the morning. Of those 12, she already had traces on 4 through the ledger work. A solicitor named Finch, who had been managing the estate's legal correspondence since Alistair's previous solicitor, a man who had served the family for 20 years, retired suddenly in the spring of 1848. A financial trustee connected to the same Yorkshire company network as the Harwick Group. 2 property assessors, whose valuation reports had consistently underestimated Ravenshade's northern holdings. "Finch handles the will," Alistair said. Seraphine stopped writing. "He revised it 18 months ago," Alistair continued. I was not well at the time. My recollection of the specific terms is not as precise as it should be." She looked at him. "What do you remember?" "The primary provisions remain as I intended," he said. "But there were amendments to the entailment conditions on the northern properties. Finch explained them as tax optimization. I was having a very bad week." "A very bad week that coincided with a Hargreave delivery," she said. Silence. "They were managing your cognitive state," she said, "timing the amendments for your worst days." He didn't respond to that immediately. She watched something move through his expression. Not shame, not quite, but the specific quality of a man confronting the gap between the competence he believed he had maintained and the competence that had actually been available to him. That gap was a wound. She didn't address it directly because he didn't need her to name it. He needed her to keep working. "Can the amendments be challenged?" she asked. "If I'm alive and mentally competent and can demonstrate coercion," he said. "Then the first priority is keeping you alive and functional," she said, "which means controlling everything that goes into this house for the foreseeable future. New suppliers, new delivery protocols, nothing from Hargreave or any connected company." "That will be noticed," he said. "Good," she said. "Let it be noticed. Let them know the access point has closed. It accelerates their timeline, which concentrates their options, which makes them easier to track." He looked at her for a moment. "You want them to panic?" I want them to move faster than they're comfortable moving, she said. Careful men making careful plans are very hard to catch. Careful men who've been forced to rush make mistakes. Alistair was quiet for a moment. Where did you learn to think like this? My father's creditors were a creative group, she said, and I was 17 when I started fighting them. The kitchen maid, her name in the household register was Agnes Howell, though Seraphine had long since concluded this was a fiction, did not appear for morning duties. Mrs. Graves reported this to Seraphine at 7, with the compressed expression of someone who had been expecting something like it. Her room? Seraphine asked. Cleared, Mrs. Graves said. Personal items gone. The room itself it's very clean, deliberately clean. Someone had trained her. You didn't clean a room that thoroughly as a natural instinct after a midnight departure. You did it because you'd been taught to remove evidence of your presence. Send no word to any employment registry, Seraphine said. I don't want our search for her visible. Yes, Your Grace. The title still produced a small internal adjustment. Not discomfort, more like the continued calibration of something recently set. She was finding that it fit differently than she'd expected. Not as borrowed clothing, but as something that had simply not been hers before and now was. She managed the morning with the surface intact, overseeing the household, directing the remaining staff with the specific combination of clarity and warmth that she had learned generated functional loyalty faster than authority alone. By midday, she had reorganized the supply protocols. By afternoon, she had drafted a letter to a London solicitor, not Finch, a different firm entirely, one she had researched through her father's old correspondence, initiating an independent review of the Ravenshade estate documents. She did not tell Alistair about the letter until it was already dispatched. He read the copy she gave him with his face arranged into something neutral, then set it on the desk. You didn't ask, he said. I didn't have time, and neither did you, she said. If I'm wrong about the firm's integrity, we've lost a week. If I'm right, and we'd waited to discuss it, we might have lost the window. A pause. You're right, he said. I know, she said. Another pause, different in quality. She was learning his pauses the way you learn the pauses of someone you are actually listening to, as opposed to the pauses of someone you are performing attentiveness toward. Alistair's silences were not empty. They were processing states. The letter to London, he said. The one you mentioned the night we found the maid. Yes. You want to send it now? Not yet, she said. We need the solicitor's review first. We need at least one layer of independently verified documentation before we make anything public. If we move publicly without that, Lucian and Pembridge have enough influence to bury the narrative before it takes hold. And if they move first? Then we go public with what we have and let the incompleteness be part of the story, she said. Half a case that's visible is harder to make disappear than a complete case that isn't. He was watching her with that quality again, the clear and unsentimental attention. You've thought about this more than you've told me, he said. I think about everything more than I tell people, she said. It's more efficient. What? The letter from Luce Sien arrived on a Thursday, 9 days after the kitchen maid's disappearance. It was not this time addressed to Seraphine. It was addressed to Alistair on Blackmore Ducal stationery, with the formal register of a legal communication rather than a personal one. She was present when Alistair read it, not by arrangement, but because she had been in his study reviewing the revised supply accounts when Holland brought the post. She watched his face while he read. Alistair had the physiognomy of a man who did not display, not from coldness, but from long practice in rooms where display was costly. But there were tells she had identified in the weeks since Harwick, a slight contraction around his jaw when something registered as a threat, and a specific stillness that preceded speech when he was deciding how much of his reaction to share. Both appeared now. He handed her the letter without comment. It was written in the careful language of legal threat. No accusation explicit enough to constitute slander, every sentence structured to carry a meaning that deniability could always detach from. The essential content, translated from its elaborate courtesy. Lucy Blackmore had become aware that the Ravenshade estate was undergoing a change of management philosophy. He wished to express concern, as a long-standing friend of the Ravenshade family, that inexperienced parties were interfering with legal and financial arrangements established for the estate's protection. He had, as an act of friendship, taken the liberty of alerting the relevant trustees to ensure continuity of established protocols. He hoped this could be resolved without the unpleasantness of formal proceedings. He's locked the trustees, Seraphine said. Yes, which means the independent solicitor's review will hit a wall. Almost certainly. She folded the letter and set it on the desk. Outside, the February wind was making sustained arguments against the manor's north windows. She had learned that Ravenshade in winter had a particular quality. The isolation was not threatening but functional, the landscape clearing out distraction with efficient brutality. He knows we're looking, she said. This letter is a warning and a wall at the same time. He's showing us he can block the legal route. What he doesn't know is what we already have, Alistair said. Correct. He thinks we're still in the early stages of a financial audit. Are we going to tell him otherwise? She looked at Alistair. The question was real. He was genuinely asking her read. No, she said. We let him believe we've hit the wall and we're regrouping. Meanwhile, we route around the trustees entirely. She thought for a moment. The chemist's documentation, Dave Port's analysis, that's not a legal or financial document. That's a forensic one. It doesn't go through estate solicitors. It goes directly to the appropriate Crown authority. Which authority specifically? He said, and she heard the precision in his tone. He was not asking rhetorically. He knew the landscape of power better than she did. He was asking her to be specific so he could assess whether her read was accurate. The Home Office has a division that handles cases of deliberate poisoning, she said. I found 2 precedents in your library. Estate cases from the 1830s where poisoning by household infiltration was prosecuted. Both went through a specific review office rather than local magistrates, specifically because local magistrates can be influenced by titled defendants. His expression shifted. You've been in my library. I've been in every room in this house, she said. I told you I would be. I didn't object, he said. A pause. The precedents, did either case succeed? One conviction, one acquittal, she said. The conviction held because the forensic evidence was introduced through a Crown chemist rather than a private analyst. Dave Port's credentials, former Crown service, that's exactly the thread we pull. Alistair sat back in his chair. She watched him run the logic chain. He was fast with it, she had learned, faster than most people his age gave him credit for, because they were looking at the cane and not the eyes. If we approach the Home Office, he said, we need the full chain assembled before we do. Once we make contact, the clock starts. Lucien will know within days. He has enough political connection to have a watch on approaches to that office. 3 weeks, she said. I need 3 weeks to build the remaining documentation. You have 2, he said. The trustees being locked means Finch will move on the will amendments within the month. Once those are formally filed, certain provisions regarding estate transfer in the event of incapacitation become active. She absorbed this. They don't need you dead, she said. Not if they can have you declared incapacitated. It would be cleaner, he said. Less risky than a death with a new wife asking questions. The fire in the grate was the only sound for a moment. Then we need to be faster, she said. We need to be faster, he agreed. It was Eleanor who brought her the information she hadn't known she was missing. Eleanor had remained in correspondence, the letters arriving through a routing system Seraphine had established through her father's housekeeper in London, 2 removes from any Ravenshade or Ashcroft address that Lucien's people might be monitoring. Eleanor's network among the servant class of London was, in practical terms, more comprehensive than anything a titled intelligence apparatus could construct, because servants were simultaneously invisible and omnipresent in every house where decisions were made. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Seraphine read it in her study with the door locked. Lucien Blackmore had, 6 weeks ago, entered into a private negotiation with a Northern Land Consortium for the sale of 3 properties contingent on their becoming available within the calendar year. The properties were described in the negotiation documents, which Eleanor had obtained through a housemaid who served at the solicitor's London office, by their survey designations only. But their survey designations matched exactly the 3 Ravenshade northern properties that bordered Lucien's existing holdings. He had already sold the land, prospectively, before it was legally his to sell. He had committed to a transaction contingent on Alistair Ravenshade's estate being transferred, by death or incapacitation, within 12 months. Seraphine sat with that letter for a long time, then she stood and walked to Alistair's study and placed it on the desk in front of him. She watched him read it. She watched the jaw contraction. She watched the stillness. She watched something beneath that, something older and quieter than anger. The specific expression of a man confronting the concrete proof of how completely he had been betrayed by someone he had considered within the context of English aristocratic alliance, at minimum professionally trustworthy. "He sold my land," Alistair said. "He sold your land," she said, "before it was his. With a 12-month contingency." Silence. "Pembridge brokered it," Alistair said. "It wasn't a question." "The consortium is registered in a name I don't recognize yet," she said, "but the structure matches the other companies. I'll trace it." He looked at her. His face was doing something she had not seen before, to not display exactly, but the absence of the suppression he usually maintained. He looked for a moment like what he was, a 70-year-old man who had spent 2 years being quietly destroyed by people who had sat at his table and taken his hospitality. "This is enough," he said. "It's close," she said. "Not quite. We need the consortium traced to Pembridge or Lucian directly, and we need the trustee lock documented as interference rather than routine administration. 2 weeks." "You said 2 weeks yesterday, and I mean it more today," she said. "Every day that passes is evidence added to the record. Every letter Lucian sends becomes part of the case." He looked at Eleanor's letter again. "You've been running an intelligence network inside my house," he said, "and outside it." "I've been running the investigation we agreed I would run," she said. "I agreed to you reviewing ledgers." "You agreed to full access and the authority to act on what I found," she said. "I've been acting on what I found." A pause. "The girl," he said. "Eleanor." "My lady's maid since I was 14, she said. "She is completely trustworthy and remarkably well connected." "And you trust those connections?" "I trust her," Seraphine said. "The connections come with her." Alistair was quiet for a long moment. Outside the wind had dropped, and the late afternoon had gone the color of pewter, the specific gray of Northumberland in winter when the light gave up before the day technically ended. "Finch is coming Friday," he said. Seraphine went still. "For what purpose?" "He sent a note this morning. I didn't mention it before because I wanted to think about it first." Alistair set Eleanor's letter down with deliberate evenness. "He wants to review the will amendments in person, with witnesses. He wants to formalize them before we can challenge them," she said, "before the independent review can be established." "Yes." "You cannot be present for that meeting in a state of cognitive compromise," she said, "which means nothing from any kitchen source between now and Friday. I'll prepare everything myself. And you need to be sharp. Sharper than you've been in months." "I'm considerably sharper now than I was 6 weeks ago," he said. She looked at him. He was right. She had been tracking it. The subtle but measurable improvement in his clarity, his energy, the steadiness of his hands, since the Hargreave deliveries had stopped. The poison clearing his system slowly, revealing the man beneath the damage. "I know," she said. "Because of you," he said. "Because we stopped feeding you arsenic," she said. "Same thing," he said. She didn't answer that. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening garden. The bare trees at the wall's edge had taken on the look of things waiting for a season to change, stripped back to their essential structure. "Friday," she said. "When Finch arrives, I want to be in that meeting." "He'll object." "Let him object," she said. "I'm the Duchess of Ravenshade. My presence at a meeting regarding the estate's testamentary instruments is not optional." A pause. "And when he tries to proceed with the amendments?" Alistair asked. "He won't," she said, "because before he does, you're going to tell him that you've initiated an independent forensic review of the estate's accounts and household management. You're not going to specify what that review has found. You're going to watch his face." Alistair considered this. "You want to see what he knows?" "I want to see whether he already knows we're past the ledger stage," she said. "If Lucien has told him what we actually have, the forensic documentation, his face will show it. If Lucien is still managing Finch on a need-to-know basis, it won't. And what does that tell us?" "It tells us whether Finch is a knowing participant or a managed instrument," she said, "which affects how we handle him going forward." Alistair was quiet for a moment. "You could have been a barrister," he said. "Women aren't permitted to be barristers," she said. "More's the loss," he said. "Don't." Finch arrived Friday precisely at 10, in a carriage that announced itself with the fussy exactitude of a man who understood punctuality as a power display. He was 60, thin in the manner of thin men who have been thin since birth and wear it without credit, with small, careful eyes and the practiced warmth of someone who had made a career of managing people's trust. Seraphine received him in the entrance hall alongside Alistair, and she watched his expression when he encountered her presence with a precision she had been sharpening for days. His surprise was real. His recovery was fast, but not quite fast enough. "Your Grace," he said to Alistair, and "the Duchess." The second title came out with a specific quality, not hostile, but containing, like a hand pressing down on something that might otherwise rise. "Mr. Finch," she said pleasantly, "I've been looking forward to meeting you. I've been reviewing the estate accounts quite thoroughly." The pause that followed was exactly 3 seconds, which she had learned was Finch's baseline processing interval. "Of course," he said. They went to the study. Alistair conducted the first 20 minutes, moving through preliminary discussion of the estate's current operational status with the measured deliberateness of a man who has decided to let his adversary believe the morning is proceeding predictably. Seraphine sat to his right, slightly behind the sightline of direct engagement, which meant Finch's attention moved between them with a slight effort that she found informative. He was managing 2 targets simultaneously, and he didn't like it. At the 23-minute mark, Alistair said, "I should mention that we've initiated a forensic review of the household management records. Independent review, separate from the estate solicitor's office." 3 seconds. "A prudent step," Finch said, "given the change in household management." His face had done something during the 3 seconds. Not much. But Seraphine had been looking for exactly what she was looking for, and she found it. Not surprise at the review itself, but a specific recalibration. The expression of someone adjusting what they planned to say next based on information they had just received that they hadn't expected to receive in this room. He knew about the forensic review. He hadn't known Alistair knew they knew. "Shall we proceed to the amendments?" Finch said. "Actually," Seraphine said, "I have a question about the entailment conditions before we do that." Finch looked at her with the careful pleasantness of someone who was actively suppressing a different expression. "Of course, Your Grace." "The Northern Property Provisions," she said. "The amendments from 18 months ago. I want to understand the specific trigger conditions for the transfer clause. Walk me through the language." A pause. "The language is quite technical. I've read the estate documentation thoroughly," she said. "I'd like your explanation." What followed was 20 minutes of some of the most technically specific conversation Seraphine had participated in, and she tracked every word of it with the attention she had developed in 6 weeks of nightly ledger work, feeling for the places where Finch's explanation diverged from the documented language, finding 2, small, careful, but there, where the paraphrase was not quite the text. When he left, promising to return with revised documentation for the following week, she and Alistair sat in the study and said nothing for a moment. "He's going to report this conversation tonight," she said. "To Lucien, by express." "Yes," Alistair said, "which means Lucien knows by tomorrow morning that we're aware of the forensic dimensions." "Which means," Alistair said, with a quietness in his voice that she had learned was not calm, but the surface of something considerably less quiet, "we're past the point where they're going to wait and manage." "Yes," she said. "What's our next move?" She looked at the window. The Friday afternoon was failing, the light going out of the garden with the brisk indifference of February in Northumberland. She had 2 weeks of documentation she needed. She now had, at best, 72 hours before Lucien moved from financial pressure to something that didn't have the shape of financial pressure at all. "We don't wait for them," she said. "We send the Home Office letter tonight." Alistair looked at her. "You said we weren't ready." "We're not," she said, "but ready matters less than first." She was already reaching for the paper on his desk, already calculating the language, already understanding with the cold precision of someone who had been in enough corners to know what corners felt like, that the moment for careful preparation had been replaced, without ceremony, by the moment for something else entirely. She had just begun writing the first line when Holland knocked. He came in with the expression he used for information that required immediate triage, and held out a letter. It was from Eleanor. She read it standing up. And the cold that moved through her then was not the cold of the night she had stood at the top of the servants' stair and heard 2 voices planning a death. It was different. It was the cold of something larger and more final, the cold of understanding that the fight she had believed was one shape was actually a different shape entirely. Lucien had not waited for Finch's report. 2 days ago, before Finch had even arrived at Ravenshade, Lucien had filed papers with the Crown's Office of Land Administration. Papers alleging that Duke Alistair Ravenshade had, over a period of 18 months, been engaged in financial transactions that constituted a breach of the conditions of his royal charter. Papers that, if accepted, would freeze the Ravenshade estate pending investigation. All assets, all properties, all legal instruments, under a Crown administrator. A Crown administrator that Eleanor's letter identified by name as a man who had served under Lord Pembridge's political direction for 11 years. Seraphine stood very still. Lucien hadn't been building toward this. This had already been built. The whole sequence, the kitchen maid, Finch's visit, the letter about the trustees, had been distraction while the real move was made somewhere they weren't watching. She looked at Alistair. "He's already filed," she said, "for Crown administration of the estate." The silence that followed had the quality of a door closing, not violently, with the specific, definitive sound of something that will not be reopened by the same mechanism that closed it. Alistair looked at the letter in her hand. Then he looked at her. "How long do we have before it's processed?" he asked. "If the administrator is Pembridge's man," she said, "not long. Maybe 3 days before the freeze takes effect." 3 days, he said. 3 days, she said. She turned back to the letter she had started and she wrote faster. She wrote the letter to the Home Office in 11 minutes. Not because 11 minutes was sufficient for the task. It wasn't. But because 11 minutes was what the situation had allocated, and Seraphine had spent enough time in the architecture of crisis to understand that sufficiency was a luxury and speed was not. She wrote with the compressed precision of someone who had rehearsed the essential argument in her head for 2 weeks without knowing she was rehearsing it, laying out the forensic chain in plain, declarative sentences. The arsenic compound, Dave Port's credentials, the delivery pattern traced to Hargreave and Sons, the ownership chain connecting Hargreave to Pembridge's brother, and Eleanor's intelligence on the prospective land sale contingent on Alistair's removal. She did not include the will amendments or Finch, not yet. Those were threads that required more documentation than she currently had in hand, and a letter to the Home Office that overreached its evidence base would be easier to dismiss than one that was conservative and precise. She sealed it. She handed it to Alistair. He read it without changing his expression, which was the expression of a man in the specific territory beyond surprise, where events have exceeded the emotional vocabulary available and the body defaults to function. "Holland," he said. "Tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight, and not through the post. Personally delivered to the London office." "Holland can't ride to London tonight in his condition," Alistair said. "His knee. Then we find someone who can." She was already thinking through the staff. The remaining household was small, and she had assessed every person in it for capability and trustworthiness during the past 6 weeks with the attention she had once applied to household accounts. Thomas, the young groundsman, he's 22, he knows the roads, and he's been with this estate since he was 14. Thomas has never carried anything more sensitive than a supply invoice. "Tonight he carries this," she said. "He doesn't need to know what it contains. He needs to know it reaches the Home Office building in Whitehall before tomorrow's morning session begins, and that he tells no one where he's going or why." Alistair looked at her for a moment. Then he called for Holland. Thomas left within the hour, the letter inside his coat and instructions in his head that he received with the serious attention of someone who understood, without being told the specifics, that the instructions were serious. Seraphine watched him go from the study window, the horse disappearing into the February dark with a speed that the urgency warranted, and felt the specific hollowness of having committed an action whose consequences were now entirely outside her control. She turned back to the room. 3 days, she said. "Before the freeze takes effect, you said." "If Pembridge's man processes it at normal speed," Alistair said, "he may move faster." "Then we assume 2, she said. "What can be legally protected in 2 days that isn't currently protected?" They spent the next 3 hours working through it. Alistair with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years learning his estate's legal architecture and could now navigate it even through the fog of recovery, Seraphine with the ledgers and the documentation she had assembled, identifying every asset that had a legal instrument separate from the main estate charter. A timber contract with an independent legal standing. 3 tenant agreements with long-term provisions that predated the current charter by decades. A mineral rights agreement with an old county arrangement. None of it was the land. The northern properties, the 3 Lucian had already sold contingently. Those were locked in the estate charter and would freeze with everything else. The land is gone, Alistair said. He said it flatly, without the performance of grief, but she heard what was beneath the flatness. It's frozen, she said, not gone. Frozen assets can be unfrozen when the basis for freezing them is shown to be corrupt. If we can show it. When we show it, she said. He looked at her. You do that deliberately. Do what? Correct my phrasing. Your phrasing assumes outcomes that mine doesn't, she said. It matters. She slept 4 hours and was at the study desk before dawn. The morning brought a development she had not anticipated, which was the first genuine surprise in a sequence of events she had otherwise been able to read at least partially ahead of. Mrs. Graves came to her at 7:30 with the face of someone who had spent the night processing information and had arrived at a conclusion she didn't want to deliver. There's something I should have told you earlier, Mrs. Graves said. Seraphine set down her pen. Sit down. Mrs. Graves sat, which was itself an indication of the weight of what she was carrying. The housekeeper was not a woman who sat in the presence of her employer without specific invitation, and Seraphine had learned that the occasions on which she accepted the invitation were the occasions that warranted attention. The physician, Mrs. Graves said, Dr. Calloway, the one who's been attending His Grace for the past 18 months. Seraphine waited. I've known for some time that his assessments were not accurate, Mrs. Graves said. His Grace's condition was never as terminal as Calloway described. I could see that. Anyone who spent real time in this house could see that. You said nothing, Seraphine said. I said nothing because I didn't know how deep it went, Mrs. Graves said. I thought perhaps Calloway was simply incompetent or overly cautious. Physicians err toward severity sometimes. It protects them from being blamed when a patient declines. She stopped. But last night I found something in the room Calloway uses when he stays over. She produced a small notebook from her apron pocket, placed it on the desk. Seraphine opened it. The handwriting inside was small and regular, professional, the notation style of someone with medical training. She moved through it carefully. The early pages were clinical records, unremarkable on the surface. Then, approximately a third of the way through, the notation style changed, became less clinical, more numerical, more specific in a way that wasn't about medical observation. Dosage records, not prescriptions, not treatment notes. Dosage records with dates and quantities, cross-referenced with a shorthand she took her 3 minutes to decode. And when she decoded it, she felt something cold move through her chest that was different from all the previous versions of cold she had experienced in the past 6 weeks. The shorthand referred to delivery mechanisms, kitchen, water supply, evening tonic, which was a preparation Calloway himself had introduced 8 months ago, prescribed as a general restorative for Alistair's declining constitution. Calloway had not been managing Alistair's illness. He had been managing Alistair's poisoning. He was not a corrupted witness to the crime. He was one of its architects. She closed the notebook. Where's Calloway now? She said. He left yesterday morning, Mrs. Graves said. His regular visit. He's due to return next Tuesday. He won't return, Seraphine said. Not here. Not if he has any intelligence at all. And he has enough to have managed this for 18 months without detection. She picked up the notebook and held it for a moment, feeling its weight, which was not the weight of paper, but the weight of the information it contained and what that information meant for the case she was building. This was the piece she hadn't had. The direct human link. Not a financial trace, not a supply chain, not a ghost employee, but a physician whose own handwriting documented his participation in a poisoning campaign. This was enough. Combined with Daveport's forensic analysis, the financial chain, and Eleanor's intelligence on the land sale, this was a case that could not be buried by political connection alone. She looked at Mrs. Graves. You've protected him, Seraphine said, all this time, without being able to say so directly. I've done what I could do, Mrs. Graves said. I know, Seraphine said. Thank you. She brought the notebook to Alistair at 8. She had expected. She wasn't certain what she had expected. Some version of controlled response, the same functional suppression he deployed against most things that should have broken through it. What she got instead was silence of a different quality than any she had encountered from him. He sat with the notebook open on his desk and did not move for a very long time, and in his stillness she could read, for the first time clearly, the full dimension of what the past 2 years had actually been. He had spent 2 years trusting a man who was systematically dismantling him, had placed his body and his health and his diminishing capability in the hands of someone who was calibrating the decline and reporting back to the people directing it. Every appointment, every examination, every measured dose of the evening tonic, a performance of care designed to accelerate the thing it claimed to treat. The closest relationships were the sharpest weapons. That was not a philosophical observation. It was what was on the desk in front of him. Calloway was at my wife's deathbed, Alistair said. Seraphine said nothing. He was with me when my son left for the continent. He attended my household for 11 years before the current arrangement. He paused. They recruited him, or they created the circumstances to make him recruitable. And I never... He stopped. You couldn't have seen it, she said. That's the design. It only works if it's invisible. I should have seen it. Men who are being slowly poisoned don't think clearly, she said, and she said it without softness because he didn't need softness. He needed accuracy. That's the point of the slow poison. It compromises the very faculty you'd use to identify the threat. What? He looked at her. Don't do what you're doing, she said. What am I doing? You're deciding this is a failure of your judgment, and I need you to set that aside right now, she said. Your judgment has been chemically impaired for 2 years. When Calloway started the evening tonic, how long after that did your clarity decline most sharply? He thought. 3 months. 3 months of sustained impairment before the most significant legal documents were revised, she said. That's the timeline. That's the evidence. Your judgment wasn't insufficient. Your judgment was targeted. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the specific qualities she had come to associate with him processing and then committing had settled into his voice. What do we do with the notebook? He said. It goes with the Home Office letter, she said. Thomas has already delivered the first communication. I need to send a second one today with the notebook's contents documented, and I need to find a way to secure the original so it can't be retrieved by anyone on Calloway's behalf. Holland is still in Newcastle, she said, which means I need to take it myself. A pause. To London, he said. To London, she said. Today. His expression did the thing it did when he was going to object and then decided not to. You'd be exposed on the road. If Lucienne has watchers, then I travel as someone other than the Duchess of Ravenshade, she said. She was already calculating the practicalities. Her own wardrobe was identifiable, the limited range of a woman who had packed for an indefinite northern relocation rather than strategic travel. Eleanor's cousin maintained a modest carriage hire business in the nearest town. I need 2 hours. Can you manage 2 hours without... I've been managing without for 70 years, he said. 2 hours is not my concern. You on the road alone is my concern. I've been managing alone since before I understood that's what I was doing, she said. I'll be back by nightfall. She stood. He said, Seraphine. She stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name without the title, without the formal address, without any social architecture around it. Just the name, in the voice that carried without effort. She turned. Be careful, he said. It was such a plain thing to say, such a direct and unornamented thing from a man who had shown her over 6 weeks that directness was his most authentic register. She felt it land somewhere more precisely than more elaborate things had managed. Always, she said. She was gone 4 hours, not 2. The carriage hire and the road consumed more time than she had allocated. She had underestimated the state of the northern roads in February, which was an error of a person accustomed to southern travel, and the hired driver was careful in ways that she would have found admirable in any other context. She arrived at the London Home Office building at midday, submitted the supplementary communication through the reception desk. She had constructed a covering letter in the carriage that was precise and specific about the forensic chain, attaching a complete transcription of Calloway's notebook, and was back in the hired carriage before she had spent more than 20 minutes inside. On the return journey, outside the 3rd hour, something went wrong. The carriage slowed. The driver's exchange with someone outside the window was too brief and too quiet, and by the time the door opened, she had already identified the options and selected the one that involved remaining still. The man who opened the door was not someone she recognized. He was large and careful and had the bearing of someone employed for situations requiring the combination of those qualities. "Lady Seraphine," he said, "or I beg your pardon, Your Grace." Behind him, visible now through the carriage window, a second conveyance sat across the road, and leaning against it with the particular posture of a man who had been waiting in the knowledge that the wait would end in his favor was Lucien Blackmore. He looked well. He always looked well. The dark hair, the Winter River eyes, the face that portrait painters would have been kind to, all of it assembled into the specific presentation of a man who had never been required to look otherwise. He walked to the carriage door. The large, careful man stepped aside. "You've been busy," Lucien said. "I've been working," she said. "The Home Office," he said. "Osan, twice in one day. That's ambitious." He knew. She filed that not with alarm, but with the cold precision of information being added to a working assessment. He had a watch on the Home Office approach, which meant the contact there was also his, or Pembridge's, or connected to the same network. "What do you want, Lucien?" she said. He tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a man who found the question interesting in its directness. "I want you to understand the position you're in before you make it worse." "I'd like to hear your description of the position I'm in," she said. "The estate is frozen," he said, "as of this morning. The Crown Administration order went through. You've been in London submitting communications to an office that is going to receive them, evaluate them, and file them pending review, which, given the current administrative calendar, means 6 to 8 weeks before anyone with relevant authority reads them." He paused. 6 to 8 weeks during which the administrator manages the estate. The assets are inaccessible, and any legal challenge to the administration order runs through courts that will process it on the same calendar. She said nothing. She was listening to everything he said and cataloging the specific detail of what he chose to include and what he chose to leave out. "The old man is done," Lucien said. "You married a title in the process of being dissolved. I understand the impulse. You were in a difficult position, and Ravenshade was an available solution. But the solution has expired." He paused again. "There is, however, a path that doesn't require you to spend the next year fighting a legal battle you will lose." "You came here to offer me a path," she said. "I came here to offer you the practical alternative," he said. "The Ashcroft family debts can be resolved. Your situation can be stabilized. In exchange for discontinuing whatever you've been building and encouraging Ravenshade to accept the administration order without challenge." She looked at him. She looked at him with the clarity of a woman who had spent 6 weeks learning what this man had done to Alistair Ravenshade, and before that spent 3 months believing she was going to marry him, and before that spent 23 years inside a world that had produced him as one of its finest examples. "You want me to tell an old man to accept the thing being done to him," she said, "after 2 years of poisoning, after you sold his land before it was legally yours, after Calloway." The slight shift in his expression when she said Calloway. Contained. Fast. "But there. You're in a carriage on a road in February," he said, "not in a position to make demands." "I'm not making demands," she said. "I'm declining your offer." "Seraphine, the conversation is finished," she said. He looked at her with the Winter River eyes, and she understood what she was seeing in them now with a precision she had not had at Harwick Hall. It wasn't contempt. It was the specific expression of a man encountering something he had not modeled. He had modeled many things. He was intelligent enough and had enough resources to model most things. He had not modeled a woman who would get back in the carriage and go back north. He stepped back. The large, careful man closed the door. She rode back to Ravenshade in silence, watching the frozen February fields move past the window, thinking through every implication of the past 4 hours with the methodical attention of someone who has learned that panic is an allocation problem. It spends resources on sensation rather than function. The Home Office contact was compromised. The 6 to 8 week delay was a real structural constraint. The estate freeze was active as of this morning. She had effectively been outmaneuvered at the institutional level. Everything she had built, the forensic chain, the financial documentation, the chemist's analysis, Calloway's notebook, was legally accessible but procedurally buried. And buried long enough for the northern properties to be formally transferred, for Alistair to be managed through the administration process. for the whole enterprise to conclude before any official review reached a decision. She needed a different mechanism. Not legal, not institutional, something that moved faster than administrative calendars and couldn't be blocked by a contact inside a single government office. She was 3 miles from Ravenshade when it arrived. Not as a plan, not yet, but as a direction. A single clear question: who, in England, had both the standing to force this into public view and a reason to want Lucian Blackmore's network of corruption exposed? The answer was not one person. The answer was a category of person. Everyone Lucienne had ever used and discarded. She was nearly at the manor gates when she saw the second carriage already inside the courtyard. Not a carriage she recognized. Fine horses, London appointment. She went cold. She climbed out before the driver had fully stopped and crossed the courtyard with the specific speed of controlled urgency, pushed through the manor's front door, and heard voices from the direction of the study, one of which was Alistair's, and one of which she did not recognize. Holland met her in the corridor. He had returned from Newcastle, and his face carried the particular expression of someone who has arrived back to find conditions materially changed from what they were when he left. "Who is in that room?" she said. "A man from the Crown Administration Office," Holland said. "He arrived an hour ago. He has papers." "What kind of papers?" "The kind," Holland said, "that require His Grace's immediate signature acknowledging the estate freeze, or, alternatively, that document his refusal to cooperate, which then triggers a secondary provision." "What secondary provision?" Holland's expression compressed further. "A psychiatric competency assessment, filed for on Calloway's medical authority." The floor did not move. She was certain it did not move. But something shifted in the architecture of the moment that had the quality of load-bearing material failing. Calloway's medical authority. The physician who had been poisoning Alistair for 2 years had filed, on his professional medical standing, a competency challenge, meaning that if Alistair refused to sign the administration papers, the mechanism activated was not legal challenge, but medical declaration. A declaration that the Duke of Ravenshade was not mentally competent to manage his own affairs, which, combined with the administration order, meant that control of every legal decision regarding the estate, including any challenge to the administration itself, transferred to the appointed administrator. Pembridge's man. She stood in the corridor for 2 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed herself, and in those 2 seconds she understood the full structure of what had been built around them. Not a wall she could route around. A cage. Legal on one side, medical on the other, institutional in the middle, with Lucienne outside it watching to see how long it took before the people inside stopped moving. Then she walked to the study door and opened it. The man from the Crown Administration Office was 50, with the specific self-satisfaction of a bureaucrat who had never been in a room where anyone questioned his authority. He sat across from Alistair with papers spread between them and a pen he had clearly already indicated Alistair should pick up. Alistair had not picked it up. He looked up when Seraphine entered. The man from the office looked up with the expression of someone encountering an interruption he considered irrelevant. "Your Grace," he said, "this is a matter of estate administration. It doesn't require—" "I'm the Duchess of Ravenshade," she said. "Every matter of this estate requires my presence." "The administration order supersedes—" "Nothing has been signed," she said. "Until it is, I have standing in this room." She moved to stand beside Alistair and looked at the papers on the desk without touching them. The language confirmed everything Holland had described. Signature or competency assessment. The cage. She looked at Alistair. He looked back at her, and in his face she saw something that she had not seen before. Not defeat, not quite, but the specific expression of a man who has run every available calculation and arrived at the edge of them. 70 years old, 2 years poisoned, his house infiltrated, his physician turned, his estate frozen, and now a pen on the desk that would either destroy his autonomy or trigger a mechanism designed to do it differently. He was asking her without words if she had anything left. She looked at the papers. She looked at the man from the office. She looked at the pen. She thought about Lucienne on the road. "You're in a carriage in February." She thought about the category of person she had identified on the way home. Everyone Lucienne had ever used and discarded. And she understood, in that moment, with the specific clarity that arrives only when every other option has been stripped away, and what remains is not comfort, but truth. That the fight she had been running, careful, documented, institutional, built to survive legal scrutiny, was not the fight she now needed to run. What she needed was not a case that could survive the courts. What she needed was a case that didn't need to. She needed the 200 people who had watched her leave Harwick Hall. She needed drawing rooms and morning calls and the specific velocity of aristocratic England when it decided it had been made complicit in something it hadn't consented to. She needed the version of public exposure that moved faster than administrative calendars because it ran on a different fuel entirely. Not legal process, but reputation, and the very specific way that reputation, once cracked, cannot be resealed by a government contact in the Home Office. She needed to do the thing she had been avoiding because it exposed her completely. It put her own history, Harwick Hall, the pale blue dress, the 200 witnesses to her humiliation, into the center of a public narrative. It meant becoming the story she had been trying to survive rather than the strategist operating in its margins. It meant she had to change what she was willing to be. She turned to the man from the office. "My husband will not be signing those papers today," she said. "If you require a reason for the record, it is that the administration order was filed on the basis of a medical assessment provided by a physician who is himself the subject of a criminal investigation by the Home Office for his role in the deliberate poisoning of the Duke of Ravenshade. That investigation is active as of this morning. The medical authority on which both the competency provision and the administration order rest is therefore contaminated." The man looked at her with the expression of someone who had not been prepared for this sentence. "If you file the competency assessment," she said, "you will be filing a document based on testimony from a man who will, within weeks, be facing criminal charges. I would encourage you to consider your own position before you do that." A silence. "I'll need to consult with my office," the man said. "Consult?" she said. "You have until tomorrow morning." He gathered his papers. He left. She and Alistair sat in the study, and the room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet after something structural has shifted inside them. "That was a threat based on an investigation that may not move as fast as you implied," Alistair said. "Yes," she said. "You bought us time." "A day," she said. "Perhaps 2. What do we do with it?" She thought of drawing rooms, of morning calls, of the specific and merciless velocity of aristocratic reputation, of the names of women she knew, women who had been managed, used, discarded, or pressured by men like Lucian Blackmore, who had sat in their own versions of Harwick Hall and walked out wearing the face they could manage. "We stop fighting this where he's strongest," she said, "and we take it somewhere he can't follow." She picked up a pen. "I'm going to write 20 letters," she said, "and I need you to tell me every name, every peer, every political ally, every titled family. Who has a reason to want Lucian Blackmore's methods made public? Not his enemies, his victims." Alistair was quiet for a moment. "That list," he said slowly, "is considerably longer than 20. She looked at him. "Then we start," she said, "with the ones who have the least left to lose. How about?" She wrote through the night. Not all 20 letters. She had been strategic about the number, throwing it out as a shape rather than a commitment, because what she actually needed was not volume, but precision. 7 letters. 7 names from Alistair's list that met the specific criteria she had identified. Titled, aggrieved, and with enough remaining social capital that their voices carried weight, but damaged enough by Lucian's network that they had stopped calculating the cost of speaking. Alistair sat across from her for the first 3 hours, naming names and providing context with the methodical accuracy of a man who had spent 40 years accumulating exactly this kind of intelligence without knowing he would one day need to deploy it as a weapon. A viscount whose land acquisition had been blocked by Pembridge's parliamentary maneuvering, leaving him with a debt structure that nearly dissolved his estate. A widow whose late husband's business interests had been acquired by a Blackmore-connected consortium at a fraction of their value during a period of deliberate legal pressure. 2 younger sons of titled families who had been publicly discredited by rumors that could be traced, if you followed them carefully, back to Lucian's social circle. Rumors deployed to clear them from positions that would otherwise have complicated Lucian's political consolidation. Every name a transaction. Every transaction a person who had absorbed the cost and been expected to stay quiet about it. By midnight, Alistair was flagging. She could see it in the quality of his attention. The slight lag between her questions and his answers, his body reasserting the claim of 2 years of damage, even as his mind continued to resist the reassertion. She told him to sleep. He refused, in the way that men who have been managing decline develop a specific stubbornness about rest. as if sleep is a concession to the thing that has been trying to diminish them. "I'll wake you if I need more names," she said. "You won't need more names," he said. "7 is enough if they're the right 7. "Then I have what I need." He looked at her across the desk, the gray eyes clear even at midnight, even after everything the day had contained. "What are you going to tell them?" "The truth," she said. "Specifically and completely. No framing, no softening, no appeal to their sympathies. Just the documented facts of what Lucian and Pembridge built, and what it has done to this estate, and what it will do to the next estate after this one if no one moves. Some of them will be afraid." "Yes," she said. "But fear and action aren't mutually exclusive. They just need to understand that silence has already cost them and will cost them more." He was quiet for a moment. "You're asking them to stand in public against one of England's most connected dukes." "I'm asking them to do what I'm doing," she said, "which is stand in public against him with documentation, which is different from standing against him on opinion alone." She set down her pen. "Go to sleep, Alistair." He went, which told her more about his actual physical state than anything he would have said directly. She sealed the last letter at 3 in the morning and sat for a moment in the specific silence of a completed action. The fire had burned low. Outside, the February dark was total and windless, the kind of still that comes in the coldest hours before dawn, when the world seems to have stopped processing and the only thing moving is whatever is moving inside you. She thought about the 7 people who would open these letters in the morning. She thought about what it cost to ask them. She thought about Lucian on the road. "You're in a carriage in February." She thought about everything that had been said to her, and about her and around her since Harwick Hall, and she felt, not for the first time but more clearly than before, the specific way in which being discarded had turned out to be the most useful thing that had ever happened to her. Not because suffering was instructive, suffering was just suffering, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling something, but because the particular version of freedom that came from having nothing left to protect in the social sphere was a freedom she would never have chosen and could not have found any other way. Lucienne had given it to her without meaning to. That was the joke at the center of all of it. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. That's it. The letters went out with Thomas at dawn, distributed across 3 different postal routes to reduce the visibility of a coordinated dispatch. She had written the addresses in a hand that was not her normal hand, a precaution that felt either very sensible or mildly excessive, and she had decided to implement it regardless. By the 3rd day, 2 responses had arrived. The Viscount wrote back in 4 lines, spare, direct, the letter of a man who had been waiting for someone to open a door he'd been standing behind for 2 years. He was in. He had his own documentation. He named a solicitor in London whose reputation for handling politically sensitive legal challenges was, apparently, considerable. The widow's letter was longer. 8 pages, written in a hand that became less controlled as the pages progressed, as if the act of writing it had released something that had been under pressure for a long time. She confirmed every detail Seraphine had described and added 3 that Seraphine hadn't known. She named Lord Pembridge directly in the acquisition of her late husband's business interests. She had kept her own records. She was in. 5 letters had not yet been answered. 1 arrived the following morning with a single word, no. No explanation. She filed that one without grief. She had expected it, had priced it into the calculation. Fear was a legitimate response to what she was asking. She didn't need all 7. She needed enough. On the 5th day after the letters, Holland came to her with a face that meant the situation had changed. "The man from the administration office is back," he said, with 2 others. She was at the study desk. She put down her pen without haste. Haste communicated information she wasn't prepared to share, and stood. "How long have they been in the entrance hall?" 4 minutes. "Tell them I'll be down in 10. She used 7 of those 10 minutes to go to Alistair's room, where he was already dressed and standing at the window with the cane and the expression of a man who had heard the carriages arrive and drawn his own conclusions. "They're not here for a courtesy visit," he said. "No," she said. "The competency assessment. They've decided to move on it regardless of the investigation. Calloway's authority is being challenged. How can they—" "They have a second physician," she said. "They must. Calloway anticipated that his own standing might be questioned and built in a secondary mechanism." She looked at him. "We need to buy 3 more days." "How?" "I'm working on it," she said. "Don't sign anything. Don't agree to any assessment. If they push on the legal authority, You demand that any competency assessment be conducted by a physician of our choosing, which is your right under the applicable statute. They'll push back. Hold the line. And what are you going to be doing while I hold the line? Writing a letter, she said. A different kind. She left him and went down to the entrance hall, where the man from the administration office, whose name she had learned was Graves, no relation to Mrs. Graves, a coincidence she found grimly appropriate, stood with two other men, one of whom had the bearing of a physician. Your Grace, Graves said, with the particular brand of administrative courtesy that was indistinguishable from contempt. We're here to proceed with the competency assessment as outlined in the administration order. You're here, she said, to attempt to proceed. Whether you do so is a separate question. The physician, a man of about 50 with careful hands and the eyes of someone who had learned to conduct examinations without engaging with what he found in them, shifted slightly. The assessment is authorized, Graves began, by the medical authority of Dr. Calloway, she said, who is currently the subject of a criminal investigation filed with the Home Office on the basis of documented evidence that he has been engaged in the deliberate poisoning of my husband over a period of no less than 18 months. The investigation is pending review. The investigation is active, she said, and the medical authority on which your assessment rests is contested. My husband has the right, under the Estates Administration Act of 1832, to request that any competency assessment be conducted by a physician not affiliated with the initiating medical authority. She looked at the physician. Are you affiliated with Dr. Calloway? A pause. I was engaged by the administration office, the physician said. Through what referral process? Silence. I'll need that answer in writing before any assessment proceeds, she said, along with your complete professional history and any current affiliations with legal or financial entities connected to the Blackmore or Pembridge families. She looked at Graves. You have 48 hours to provide that documentation. Until then, the assessment is procedurally suspended under the Act. She had read the Estates Administration Act of 1832 in its entirety the previous evening, all 63 pages of it. She had found the provision she needed on page 41. Graves looked at her with the expression of a man who had come prepared for a particular kind of resistance and encountered a different kind. 48 hours, he said. 48 hours, she confirmed. Holland will show you out. She wrote the letter that afternoon, not to a peer, not to a titled ally or a political contact, to a journalist, specifically to the editor of a publication called The Northern Chronicle, which Alistair's library had introduced her to, a paper with a reputation for covering exactly the intersection of aristocratic power and institutional corruption that defined their situation, written for an audience that was educated enough to understand the stakes and sufficiently outside the titled class to have no loyalty to its protection. The letter was the most dangerous thing she had written, not because it was dishonest. She had been meticulous about documentation, attaching copies of the financial chain, Daveport's analysis summary, and Eleanor's intelligence on the prospective land sale, but because it was irreversible. Once a journalist had this material, the trajectory of the story left her hands. It moved on the newspaper's logic, not hers, at a speed determined by the publication's own interests and calendar. She had spent 6 weeks building a case designed to survive institutional scrutiny. This was a different mechanism entirely. This was dropping a lit match. She sealed it. She held it for a moment. She thought about the 48-hour window she had bought and what it was actually worth. 2 days before Graves came back with whatever documentation he manufactured. 2 days before the assessment proceeded, and Alistair's autonomy was placed in the hands of a system that had been built to remove it. She handed the letter to Thomas. Same routing as before? He asked. No, she said. Direct. Fast as you can. Masette. The response came in 36 hours. Not by letter. The journalist, a man named Carver, whose name had appeared at the bottom of 3 articles Alistair had in his library files on aristocratic land consolidation schemes, arrived at Ravenshade Manor in person, in a carriage that announced itself without apology, at 7 in the morning. He was younger than she had expected, 35 perhaps, with an economy of movement that suggested someone who had learned to enter rooms prepared to be asked to leave them. He sat across from her in the study and asked questions for 2 hours, and the quality of his questions told her everything she needed to know about whether this had been the right decision. He wasn't looking for scandal. He was looking for structure. The land sale, he said. The prospective sale before the estate was legally available. You have the documentation from the London registry? Copies, she said. The originals are secured with a separate party. Dave Port's analysis. He'll speak to this publicly? He'll provide a sworn statement, she said. He was Crown Service. He understands what sworn means. And the Calloway notebook, the original. Secured, she said. He wrote. He asked 3 more questions, each more specific than the last, each landing on exactly the pressure points she had identified as the strongest elements of the chain. She answered each one with the same precision she had used in the Home Office letter, and something shifted in his expression across the 2 hours. Not warmth, not exactly, but the specific quality of a person encountering material that meets the standard they apply to material worth the risk of publishing. When can you run it? She asked. 4 days, he said. I need to verify 3 elements independently. If they hold, and I believe they will, 4 days. 4 days. The administration office had 36 hours left on her 48-hour suspension, which meant Graves would return before the article ran. There's a procedural challenge coming the day after tomorrow, she said. A competency assessment that is designed to remove my husband's legal standing before any public challenge can be mounted. Carver looked at her steadily. You're asking me to run it sooner. I'm telling you the timeline, she said. What you do with it is your decision. He was quiet for a moment, then 2 days. I can verify the critical elements in 2 days if I start now. Start now, she said. Graves came back on schedule, with the documentation she had requested and the physician and 2 additional men whose function was clearly not medical. Seraphine met them in the entrance hall with Holland and Mrs. Graves flanking her, and what followed was 40 minutes of procedural combat conducted in the controlled register of people saying legal things to each other while meaning something rawer underneath. The physician's documentation was clean. She had expected that. They had had 48 hours to manufacture clean documentation, and they had clearly used it. The referral chain showed no direct affiliation with Calloway or Pembridge. The administrative paperwork was in order. She had 1 move left on this particular board. The assessment will be conducted with the Duchess present, she said. That is not standard protocol. My husband has the right to have a witness present during any medical assessment that bears on his legal competency, she said, under the same act. Show me the provision that excludes his spouse. Graves couldn't, because there wasn't one. The assessment took place in the study, which she had chosen deliberately. Alistair's territory, his books on the shelves, the desk where he had been working for 40 years surrounding him with the specific evidence of a functioning mind. She sat to the side and said nothing, watching the physician conduct the assessment with the attention of someone who was going to document every question and every answer in the notes she was making on the pad in her lap. Alistair was, she realized as she watched, remarkable. 2 years of arsenic poisoning had not taken his mind. It had slowed him, clouded him, worked against him in the specific ways the chemical compounds were designed to work. But the underlying structure was intact, and in the weeks since the Hargreave deliveries stopped, that structure had been reasserting itself with a consistency she found, in this particular moment, extraordinarily moving. He answered every question, precisely. Without hesitation on the ones that required precision, with appropriate deliberateness on the ones that warranted it. He named the date, the year, the full legal description of the estate's primary charter, the names of his trustees, the terms of 3 separate legal instruments from memory, the parliamentary statute under which the administration order had been filed. The physician's face, as the assessment progressed, underwent a subtle and involuntary adjustment. He had come prepared to find incapacity. He was finding the opposite. When it was over, he gathered his papers with the careful neutrality of someone who had not found what they were sent to find and was now navigating the specific difficulty of reporting that to the people who had sent them. Your assessment, Graves said. I'll need to review my notes before filing an official conclusion, the physician said. Today, Graves said. The filing is due today. A silence. My professional assessment, the physician said, slowly, is that the Duke of Ravenshade demonstrates full cognitive function within the parameters established by the Act. He didn't look at Graves when he said it. He looked at his papers. I cannot, in professional conscience, file a competency challenge on the basis of today's assessment. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Seraphine had heard in weeks. Graves looked at her. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been running a system and has just watched a component of that system decline to operate. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," she said. "Go." Oh. The article ran the following morning. She learned about it through Eleanor, who had obtained an early copy through the same network that had delivered everything else, and who sent it to Ravenshade by the fastest route available. It arrived at the manor at 10 in the morning, 2 days after Carver had left. Carver had used everything: the financial chain, Daveport's summary, the land sale documentation, the Callaway notebook extracts, Eleanor's intelligence. He had written it with the structural clarity of someone who understood that the most devastating version of this story was the plain version. No embellishment, no dramatization, just the sequence of events laid out in a prose so clean that the facts themselves constituted the indictment. The headline read, "The Slow Dissolution of Ravenshade, How a Duke Was Poisoned and His Estate Was Sold Before His Death." She read it standing at the study window. Then she handed it to Alistair. He read it sitting down. He read it twice. Then he set it on the desk. "It names Pembridge directly," he said. "Yes." "And Lucian." "By documented connection," she said. Carver was careful. "Every name is tied to a document." Alistair was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the February sky had broken for the first time in weeks. A pale and grudging sunlight working through the cloud cover and falling across the garden walls with the tentative quality of something that wasn't sure it was welcome. "How long before they respond?" he said. "They're already responding," she said. "Lucienne has been responding since I sent the first Home Office letter. The difference now is that the response is public. They can suppress a Home Office filing. They can manage an administrative process. They can buy a physician and manufacture documentation." She looked at him. "They cannot unpublish a newspaper." He looked at her. The gray eyes held something she was still learning to read. Not sentiment, not gratitude exactly, but the specific quality of a man who has been alone in a fight for a long time and is processing the experience of no longer being alone in it. "Eleanor's network," he said. "How many people have seen this by now?" "In London?" she thought. "By midday, every drawing room in Mayfair." "And by tomorrow?" "Every estate in England that takes the Chronicle," she said, "which is most of them." Lucien's response arrived not as a letter, but as a presence. He came to Ravenshade. She learned he was coming 4 hours before he arrived. Eleanor's network again, a message relayed through 3 removes that placed Lucien's carriage on the northern road with 2 additional vehicles and an escort that suggested he had made the calculation that arrival in force was a more effective statement than arrival alone. She had 4 hours. She used them to send 2 messages, one to the Viscount, one to the widow, alerting them that the next 24 hours would determine the trajectory of everything they had discussed, and that if they could be at Ravenshade by morning, she believed their presence would be decisive. She used the remaining time to prepare the study. Not physically. The room required nothing. But she went through every document, every copy, every piece of the chain they had built over 6 weeks, and she arranged it in the order she would need if this became the confrontation it was shaped to become. She had learned, in 2 years of managing her father's creditor situation, that the prepared person in a room has an advantage that confidence alone cannot replicate. Preparation was a kind of armor. It didn't prevent damage, but it made damage survivable. Alistair found her in the study at 4 in the afternoon. "He's an hour out," he said. "I know." He sat down across from her. He looked at her with the directness he had used since the first day. The clear, unsentimental attention that had been the first thing she had identified as distinguishing him from every other person she had spoken to since Harwick Hall. "Whatever happens in the next hour," he said, "I want you to know that you have done something here that I could not have done alone." Neither could I," she said. "Alone." "That's what I mean," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the morning she had arrived at Ravenshade in a hired carriage, wearing gray, with nothing she had chosen and everything she had been forced to accept. She thought about the woman she had been then, not broken, but operating in the wreckage of something, navigating by a compass she wasn't entirely sure was calibrated. She thought about what 6 weeks inside this house, with this man, building this case, had cost her and given her in equal and inseparable measure. "When this is over," she said, "I want to see the northern properties." "The land," he said. "The land he sold before it was his," she said. "I want to walk it." Something moved in his face. "You will," he said. "I promise you that." Yeah, Lucien arrived at 5:30. He came through the front entrance with the bearing of a man on his own ground, which was a performance and a miscalculation simultaneously. The bearing communicated what he intended, but the fact of the performance communicated something else to anyone paying the right kind of attention. He had Pembridge with him, 2 solicitors, a man she recognized from Eleanor's description as the administrator Graves reported to. They came into the entrance hall and Seraphine was there, not Alistair, her. Lucien stopped. The pause was less than a second. Then the Winter River eyes adjusted and he said, "Where's the Duke?" "He'll join us shortly," she said. "He's finishing a communication to the Northern Chronicle's legal correspondent, who asked for a direct statement regarding the article's accuracy." She paused. His Grace confirmed every element, in writing. Lucien looked at her the way he had looked at her on the road in February, with the expression of a man encountering something he had not modeled. But this version was different. On the road, the expression had contained a residue of the assessment he had made at Harwick Hall. The assessment that she was a manageable quantity, a woman in a bad position making limited moves. That residue was gone now. What remained was something cleaner and considerably less comfortable. He was looking at her as what she actually was. "The article is damaging," he said, "but it's a newspaper piece. Newspapers are not courts." "No," she said, "but they're faster than courts." "Seraphine, Your Grace," she said. A silence. Pembridge spoke for the first time. He was 65, built like a man who had been political for 40 years, with the specific solidity of someone who had absorbed a great deal of opposition without physical consequence. "The documents referenced in the article are disputed," he said. "The chain of ownership you've published is incomplete and in several elements factually incorrect. We will be pursuing defamation proceedings against the Chronicle and against me," she said. "Yes, I expected that." "You expected it," Lucien said. "Defamation proceedings require the claims to be false," she said. "The ownership chain is complete and accurate. The Daveport analysis is forensic documentation from a former Crown analyst whose methods are established and whose record is unimpeachable. The Callaway notebook is the physician's own handwriting." She looked at Pembridge. "The prospective land sale was registered in your name, Lord Pembridge. Not an affiliate, not a subsidiary. Your name, on a document in the London Registry, for land that was not legally available for sale." Pembridge's face did something controlled and unsuccessful. "We'll dispute the interpretation," he began. "Interpretation?" The voice came from the doorway. Alistair had come down. He walked into the entrance hall with the cane and without hurry, and the specific quality of his presence in the space. Tall, white-haired, stripped by illness to his essential structure, but carrying in that structure something that the years and the poison and the 2 solicitors and Lucien Blackmore in his best coat had not managed to remove, produced a silence that was different from all the previous silences. He looked at Lucien. Lucien looked at him. And Seraphine, watching both of them, understood that she was watching 2 men who had known each other within the specific context of English aristocratic alliance, not as friends, not as enemies, but as the kind of adjacent powers who exist in relation to each other through mutual recognition of standing, and that the recognition on Lucien's side was now containing something it hadn't had room for before. He had expected the old man to be diminished. He had spent 2 years engineering the diminishment. What was standing in the entrance hall of Ravenshade Manor was not diminished. "Lucien," Alistair said, "you sold my land." "Alistair, you sold my land," Alistair said again, with a quietness that was not the quietness of age. "Before I was dead, before I was legally incapacitated, before any instrument that transferred ownership was valid. You sold it," he paused, "and you poisoned me to make the sale possible." "That is an extraordinary accusation. It is a documented fact," Alistair said, "which is a different thing. I spent 40 years learning the difference between those 2 things. I imagine you know it as well as I do." Lucien's jaw tightened. "You have a choice," Alistair said, "right now, in this room. You can proceed with whatever your solicitors have prepared, and we can allow the next stage of this to play out publicly, with every document we have placed into the record through whatever legal form presents itself first." He paused. "Or you can tell me in this room, in front of these witnesses, where the 3rd compound came from." Silence. "The Continental compound," Seraphine said. "The one Daveport couldn't identify. We have enough without it. But your cooperation in identifying its source would be noted. Lucien looked at her, then at Alistair, then at Pembridge. Pembridge's face had gone the specific gray of a man watching the walls of a structure he built come apart in a sequence he cannot reverse. Lucien, Pembridge said, low and warning. Lucien looked at his oldest political ally, and something crossed his face that Seraphine had not seen there before. Not remorse, not shame. Something rawer. The expression of a man who has run a very long operation and is watching the moment it ends and is realizing, possibly for the first time, what it actually cost. One of the solicitors put a hand on his arm, and from outside, from the direction of the main road, audible now in the entry hall silence, came the sound of 2 more carriages arriving at the gates of Ravenshade Manor. Seraphine did not look away from Lucien's face. "The Viscount and Lady Marchmont," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "They said they'd try to be here by evening." Lucien went very still. Lady Marchmont was the widow. The 8 pages of handwriting, increasingly uncontrolled, the woman who had kept her own records. "How many?" Lucien said. She looked at him, and she said nothing, because the answer was written in the sound of those carriages, and in the 7 letters she had sent, and in everything that had been building since the moment she had decided to stop fighting where he was strongest. The sound of the carriages was not the answer, it was the beginning of the answer. And Lucien Blackmore, standing in the entrance hall of the estate he had spent 2 years trying to take, with Pembridge going gray beside him, and the documentation of everything he had done already in a newspaper, and already in the hands of the Home Office, and already in the sworn statements of a Crown analyst, and already in the memory of a woman who forgot nothing. Lucien Blackmore looked at her and understood, for the first time with the full weight of the understanding, that he had made a catastrophic error. Not at the land sale. Not at Harwick Hall. The error was what he had done to her, specifically in the specific way he had done it. He had taken a woman who had nothing left to protect and pointed her at a fight. He had not understood what that produced. He was about to. The Viscount's name was Edmund Carow, and he walked through the gates of Ravenshade Manor with the specific bearing of a man who had decided, somewhere on the 4-hour journey north, that he was done calculating the cost of what he was about to do. Lady Marchmont came behind him in her own carriage, smaller and darker, and moving with the compressed purposefulness of someone who had been carrying 8 pages of handwritten documentation for 2 years and was finally being given somewhere to put them down. Seraphine met them in the courtyard. She had perhaps 90 seconds before Lucien's solicitors regrouped from the shock of the arrivals and began whatever procedural countermove they had prepared for exactly this kind of escalation. She used those 90 seconds to tell Carow and Lady Marchmont, whose given name was Helena, she learned in that moment, Helena Marchmont, a woman of 50, with eyes that had seen a great deal and decided to keep seeing clearly, exactly what the next hour required. "You don't need to speak first," she said. "You don't need to speak at all if that's your choice. Your presence here is the statement. But if you're willing to speak to what happened to your estate and to your husband's business, Lady Marchmont, that changes the shape of the room." Helena Marchmont looked at her for a moment with the assessment of one woman taking the measure of another. "I've been waiting 2 years to speak to it," she said. "Point me at the room." "What?" They went in together. Lucien had not left. She had half expected him to. There was a version of him that would have read the arriving carriages and made the cold calculation that departure was strategically superior to confrontation. But he had stayed, which told her something she filed for later. He had not yet accepted that the ground had shifted irreversibly. He was still operating on the assumption that this was a negotiation with a recoverable outcome. The entrance hall had become a different kind of space in the minutes she had been in the courtyard. Alistair stood at its center with the cane, and the stillness she had learned was not passivity, but its opposite. The specific stillness of a man who had decided exactly what he was and was not going to move from it. Pembridge had retreated toward the wall, which was a physical manifestation of something internal. The 2 solicitors were conferring in low, rapid tones that communicated anxiety more than strategy. Lucien saw Carow first. Something shifted in his face. Recognition, and then the rapid recalculation of someone who is updating a model of how badly things have gone. Then he saw Helena Marchmont, and the recalculation completed, and what replaced it was not panic, but the specific expression of a man who has run a very long operation and is watching the moment it becomes undeniable. "Edmund," he said to Carow. "Lucien," Carow said. I have with me 14 documents. 12 of them relate directly to the parliamentary maneuvering that blocked my land acquisition in the spring of 1847. 2 of them identify the source of that maneuvering. He paused. Do you want me to name the source in this room, or would you prefer to review them privately first? The silence was the kind that has weight. Lady Marchmont, Lucian said. Your Grace, Helena said, and the title came out with the specific flatness of a courtesy so stripped of warmth that it functioned as its opposite. I have a sworn statement from my late husband's solicitor, prepared before his death and held in escrow with instructions for its release in exactly these circumstances, documenting the mechanism by which the Blackmore Consortium applied legal pressure to force the sale of Marchmont trading interests at below-market valuation. She stopped. He knew this day would come. He simply didn't know who would bring it. She looked at Seraphine when she said that last sentence. Lucian looked at Seraphine too, and she stood in the entrance hall of Ravenshade Manor, which was her house, her legal domain, the house she had entered in gray 8 weeks ago with nothing she had chosen. And she looked back at the man who had worn Winter River eyes and a Harwick Hall expression and a coat that portrait painters would have been kind to, and she felt, for the first time since this began, the specific quiet that arrives when a thing has been fully completed. Not triumph. Triumph was too loud for what she felt. This was quieter. This was the quality of a room after a long storm has passed, not cheerful, not comfortable, but genuinely still. Lucienne, she said, it's over. It took 3 more hours to complete. The solicitors managed the procedural elements. The formal documentation of Caro's and Helena's evidence, the withdrawal of the administration order in the face of the now documented basis for its corruption, the preliminary agreement to refer the full case file to the Crown's legal office for criminal proceedings. Pembridge said almost nothing after the first 30 minutes, which was itself a kind of statement. He had the look of a man who had spent 40 years building something and was now watching its structural failure proceed too fast for intervention. Lucienne spoke twice more of any consequence. The first time was to Alistair, in the quieter aftermath when the solicitors were managing paperwork and Caro and Helena were being settled by Mrs. Graves into the sitting room with tea that Seraphine had prepared herself. He approached Alistair in the study doorway, not with the bearing of authority he had carried into the entrance hall, but with something stripped of that, something underneath it that was harder to name. I want you to know, Lucian said, that the original intention was not— Stop, Alistair said. Lucian stopped. Whatever the original intention was, Alistair said, the method was 2 years of arsenic and a physician who sat at my wife's deathbed. He paused. I don't need to hear about intention. I need you to cooperate fully with the Crown's proceedings. That's the only conversation I'm interested in having with you. Lucian looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and walked away. The second time was to Seraphine at the entrance, as he was leaving. He stopped beside her and said nothing for a moment. She waited, with the patience of someone who no longer needed anything from this interaction. Not explanation, not apology, not even acknowledgement. She had stopped needing those things somewhere in the 6 weeks of ledgers and letters and night work, and the freedom of that was clean and complete. You would have been wasted on me, he said finally. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. I know, she said. Goodbye, Lucian. He left. She watched the carriage go down the road and disappear into the Northumberland dark, and she stood at the door of Ravenshade Manor until the sound of it was gone, and then she turned back inside and closed the door behind her. The legal proceedings took 4 months. Carver's article had done what she had needed it to do, moved faster than the institutional machinery Lucian controlled, established the public narrative before the counter-narrative could be built, and created the specific kind of accountability that political connection struggles to suppress once it is in broad circulation. The Chronicle ran 2 follow-up pieces, each more specific than the last, each grounded in the documentation that Dave Port and Helena Marchmont's solicitor provided through proper sworn channels. Calloway was the first to face formal charges. He provided a statement in exchange for a reduced charge that named every instruction he had received and from whom, which unraveled the medical dimension of the conspiracy with a thoroughness that no forensic documentation alone could have achieved. His statement named 3 intermediaries between himself and Pembridge, each of whom, faced with the same calculus, provided their own statements. The chain unwound with the specific velocity of structures built on mutual self-interest, fast, complete, and without loyalty when the structure began to fail. Pembridge's parliamentary standing was suspended pending investigation within the first 6 weeks. His land consortium, the one registered in his name in the London Registry, was frozen. The 3 Ravenshade Northern properties, which had been the object of the prospective sale, were unfrozen when the administration order was formally invalidated on the grounds that its medical basis had been provided by a physician now under criminal indictment. Lucien lost his seat on 2 joint stock company boards before the formal proceedings had concluded. The social arithmetic that had moved against Seraphine at Harwick Hall reversed with the same impersonal efficiency, not because the people involved had changed their fundamental nature, but because the direction of advantage had changed. Aristocratic England did not reverse judgment out of principle. It reversed it out of the same calculation that had produced the original judgment. She did not find this surprising. She found it accurate. She attended none of the formal proceedings. Alistair attended 2, providing a sworn statement in the second that was, by all accounts relayed to her afterward, delivered with the compressed precision of a man who had been waiting to deliver it for 2 years and had spent the intervening time making sure every word was exactly right. She spent those months at Ravenshade. The estate in spring was a different creature than the estate in winter. She had arrived in February when the moors were gray and the garden was bare, and the light gave up early without apology. By April, the garden walls were producing the first green at their base, and the moors had changed from gray to the complex brown gold of dormant heather beginning to remember what it was. By May, she walked the grounds in the morning before the household was fully awake, learning the estate the way you learn a language. Not all at once, but through accumulated exposure, each morning adding detail to the previous morning's understanding until the whole began to have the quality of something known. She learned that Alistair had built the garden wall himself, with 2 laborers, in the summer of his 35th year, that the timber in the east wing came from trees he had planted at 19 and harvested at 40, that the tenant families on the northern edge of the estate had been there since his grandfather's time and maintained the kind of sustained loyalty that is not produced by fear or financial incentive, but by the specific experience of being treated, over decades, as people rather than instruments. She learned all of this by walking the ground and asking questions, and the answers accumulated into a portrait of a man she had been living alongside for months, but was still, in certain important respects, discovering. Alistair recovered. That was the plain fact at the center of everything else, and it carried a weight that no legal outcome or social reversal could replicate. The arsenic had been leaving his system since the Hargreave deliveries stopped, and what the clearing revealed was not the old man the physicians had described, the failing, terminal, diminishing figure whose month was running out, but something more complicated and more durable. He gained weight slowly through the spring. His hands steadied. The clarity that had been present even through the worst of the chemical fog became, without the fog, something sharper and more consistently available. He was not a young man. He would never be a young man again. The 2 years of poisoning had cost him things that recovery could not fully restore. There were mornings when the fatigue was real and the cane was non-negotiable, and the body's accounting with what it had been through presented itself without sentiment. He did not pretend otherwise. She had never wanted him to. What she had wanted, what she had not known she wanted when she arrived in Grey in February with nothing she had chosen, was exactly what she found herself in possession of by the time the moors were fully green and the garden was producing more than bare structure. A person who told her the truth. She had not understood before Ravenshade how rare that was. How much of her life had been conducted in the atmosphere of managed information. Her father's illness discussed in the careful language of optimism, her mother's fears expressed as criticisms, Lucien's entire engagement conducted in a register that she had mistaken for restraint and discovered was performance. She had spent 23 years in rooms where people said what was useful rather than what was accurate. Alistair said what was accurate. Always, without softening it to manageability, without framing it to protect the listener's comfort. He said it because he had arrived, through age and loss and 2 years of poisoning, at the specific territory where honesty was the only register that still seemed worth the energy of speech. She found, in the spring of that year, that she had arrived there too. It was a Thursday in late May when she finally walked the northern properties. Alistair came with her. The ground was firm enough by then, and he had been walking more each week, not as a performance of recovery, but as the natural expression of a body reclaiming what had been taken from it. They took the eastern path from the manor, which Holland showed them on a map he had drawn from memory and which turned out to be accurate to within 20 feet. The northern properties were 3 parcels of land on the upper edge of the Ravenshade territory, separated from the main estate by a ridge of low hills that the morning light came over at an angle that changed their color from brown to gold in the transition between early and full day. She had seen them on maps for months. She had not been prepared for what they were in person. They were beautiful in the specific way of northern English land, not charming, not picturesque, not the kind of beautiful that required favorable conditions to be visible. They were beautiful in a fundamental way that had nothing to do with the season or the light or the angle of viewing. They were simply what they were, and what they were was enough. She stood at the ridge and looked at the 3 parcels and thought about Lucien's signature on a document in the London registry, about the contingency clause, about the specific calculations that had produced the plan to remove Alistair from the world and transfer this ground to people who had never stood on it. She thought about what it meant to want something badly enough to destroy another person for it. She had spent months in the proximity of that want, had studied it through ledgers and letters and legal documents, had traced its financial instruments and its human instruments, had sat in rooms with it and watched it respond to pressure. She understood its logic. She did not understand its interior, and she was glad she didn't. There were things about human beings that it was better not to understand from the inside. "What are you thinking?" Alistair asked. He was standing beside her, looking at the same land. "I'm thinking about what it costs," she said, "to want something that badly." "The land," he said. "The land, the title, the position." She paused. "Any of it, at that price." Alistair was quiet for a moment. The morning wind moved through the heather below the ridge, producing a sound that was not quite music, but had the quality of something organized. "I spent 40 years building this estate," he said, "not accumulating it. My father left me what he left me, but building it into what it is. The tenants, the timber contracts, the legal structures." He paused. "I thought when I understood what was happening that losing it would be the worst thing, that the thing they were taking was the work." "And now?" she said. "The work will survive," he said. "The land is still land. The tenants are still here. What they almost took was the thing you can't document, the 40 years of decision-making and consequence and learning that made the work possible." He looked at her. "You preserved that, not by protecting the estate legally, though you did that, by keeping me alive long enough to keep being the person who built it." She looked at him. The gray eyes in the morning light were clear and direct and carrying something she had learned to read accurately. "I didn't do it for the estate," she said. "I know," he said. The wind moved through the heather again. Below them, visible from the ridge, the roofline of Ravenshade Manor was just visible against the northern sky, pewter and solid and not beautiful in any easy sense, but present in a way that a building becomes present only after you have lived through something inside it. "Alistair," she said. "Yes." "I want to talk about the garden," she said. "The walled section. Mrs. Graves says you designed it yourself." The corner of his mouth moved, the precursor to a smile. "In the summer of my 35th year." "I know. What was it like before?" He started to describe it, and she listened, and they stood on the ridge above the northern properties with the morning light changing around them, and the conversation was the most ordinary one she had participated in since February. Not strategic, not urgent, not conducted in the shadow of something that needed to be stopped or built or delivered. Just 2 people standing on ground they had kept, talking about a garden. She understood in that moment something she had not had language for when she arrived. The thing she had gained was not the title or the legal victory or the social rehabilitation that the Northern Chronicle coverage had produced as a secondary effect. The thing she had gained was this: the specific freedom of a life conducted in honest company, on solid ground, with the work of it visible around her. She had not chosen any of the conditions that produced it. She had chosen what to do inside those conditions, and that choosing had been, it turned out, enough. The formal sentencing of Pembridge and Calloway occurred on a Wednesday in July. Seraphine was in the garden when Holland brought her the news. She was deadheading the roses on the south wall, a task she had taken over from the groundsman not out of necessity, but because she found, to her own continuing surprise, that physical work in the garden produced a quality of mental stillness that she had not found elsewhere. Her hands were dirty, the morning was warm. She read Holland's note twice. Pembridge, stripped of his parliamentary seat, significant financial penalties, 18 months in the Crown's correctional facility. Callaway, criminal conviction for conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm through deliberate poisoning, 3 years. The land consortium was dissolved. The 3 Ravenshade Northern properties remained Ravenshade. Lucian's outcome was different, and in some ways more complete than criminal sentencing would have been. He faced no criminal charges. His connection to the poisoning had been sufficiently indirect and sufficiently layered through Pembridge and Callaway that direct criminal culpability could not be established to the required standard. But the civil proceedings were another matter. The prospective land sale, the document in the London Registry with his implied authorization, generated a civil action that resulted in a judgment of significant financial liability. Combined with the departure of his political allies in the aftermath of the Chronicle coverage and the social arithmetic that had run its course as the proceedings became public, he had lost, by the time the dust settled, most of what had made him formidable. Not his title, not his estate. Those remained stripped of the financial infrastructure and political network that had been their real substance. He remained the Duke of Blackmore. He remained a man with a house and a name. He was simply no longer a man anyone was afraid of. She had thought, when she allowed herself to imagine this outcome in the long February nights of ledger work, that she would feel something larger when it arrived. Some version of completion that had the quality of a door closing decisively. What she felt instead was smaller and more specific. She felt the warmth of the July morning on her hands. She felt the texture of the rose stems and the clean smell of the garden after 2 weeks of good weather. She felt the weight of Holland's note, which was not very heavy. She put the note in her pocket and went back to the roses. Oek. That evening, she and Alistair sat on the bench at the edge of the walled garden as the light failed. It was a habit they had developed without naming it. The end of the day in the garden, the light going out over the moors in the slow way of northern summer, the conversation ranging or not ranging depending on what the day had contained. She had told him about the sentencing at dinner. He had received it with the same quality he brought to most things, attentive, precise, and without the performance of a larger reaction than he actually felt. Now in the garden, he said, "Are you satisfied?" She thought about it. It was the kind of question she preferred to answer accurately rather than quickly. "Satisfied isn't the right word," she said. "It implies I wanted something that has now been given to me. What I wanted was for it to stop. It has stopped." She paused. "That's different from satisfaction." "What does it feel like?" She looked at the garden, at the roses she had been working on that morning, which in the failing light had taken on the quality of shapes rather than colors, form rather than spectacle. At the wall Alistair had built with 2 laborers in the summer of his 35th year. At the sky above the wall, which was doing the things northern English skies did in July evenings, the light lasting longer than it had any practical reason to. "It feels like the beginning of the part where we figure out what we actually do with all of this," she said. Alistair was quiet for a moment. "The estate management proposals you drafted last month," he said. "The tenant contract revisions." "Yes. I want to implement them." She looked at him. "All of them?" "The ones that make sense, which is most of them." He paused. "You see things in the operation of this estate that I have been too close to see, that has value." She was quiet for a moment. "You're not giving me a compliment." "No," he said. "I'm telling you how I intend to run this duchy for however long I have left to run it." He paused. "With your specific and substantial involvement." She almost smiled. "You could simply ask." "I am asking," he said. "I am asking in the way I ask things, which is directly and without excess decoration." She looked at the garden. She thought about the woman who had arrived in February wearing gray, who had come to marry a dying man and oversee his final month with the specific efficiency of someone who had nothing left to lose and nowhere better to be. She thought about what that woman had known and not known about what she was walking into. She had known the ledgers would need reviewing. She had not known about the northern ridge and May morning light. She had known Alistair was not what the physicians described. She had not known what he actually was. Had not known that the thing underneath the age and the illness and the stripped-back structure was the closest thing to a genuine peer she had ever encountered. She had known she was changing. She had not known into what. "Yes," she said, "I'll do it." "Good," he said. The light continued to fail over the moors, doing it slowly, the way northern English light did everything, without rush, without drama, with the specific patience of something that understood it, had time. She sat on the bench beside the man she had married in a room with 2 witnesses and no ceremony, in a house where someone had been trying to kill him for 2 years, in the middle of the worst period of her life. And she felt, in the garden's quiet, in the warmth that the July stones still held from the day's sun, the specific texture of what it meant to have arrived somewhere. Not safety, not comfort, exactly. Something more honest than either. Ground that held. She had been looking for it, she understood now, before she had words for what she was looking for. In her father's library at midnight, in the structure of Tacitus, in the cold precision of ledger work, in the 7 letters sent to people who had nothing left to lose. She had been building towards solid ground through every version of the fight, and the fight had been real, and the cost had been real, and nothing about it had been what she would have chosen. And here was the ground. Here was what remained after the storm had finished with everything it intended to take. She looked at Alistair. He was watching the moors with the stillness that was not passivity, the specific stillness of a man who had come through 2 years of being quietly destroyed and found, on the other side of it, that he was still standing. She thought, we are 2 people who should not be here, who are here, on solid ground that we kept. She thought, that is enough, more than enough. It is everything. The last light left the garden with the same unhurried patience with which it had been going, and the moors went dark beyond the wall, and the bench held them both, and neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was the silence of people who had nothing left to manage or perform or protect. Just the garden, just the evening, just the ground beneath them, which was theirs, which held. The gates of Ravenshade were closed for the night. Inside them, nothing was broken anymore.